When the body of a teenage girl was found murdered, the tiny town of Wausau in Wisconsin was gripped by fear. Everyone worried they might be the next victim of the ruthless intruder. But if the motive was money, why didn't he take it? The stories of the suspects only puzzled the detectives further. They wondered, was this merely a show to conceal what was really happening behind closed doors? Or was it genuine grief over the loss of a loved one? Until they found a startling clue that could put the final nail in the killer's coffin. Saturday, May 2nd, 2009, began like any other day for the emergency services in the quiet town of Wausau, Wisconsin. Although it was expected to be an uneventful day, a call came in at 1:30 p.m. A woman reported that her neighbor had asked her to call an ambulance for his brother's girlfriend. She was lying on the floor of their apartment with a throat wound and cuts all over her body. The police officers dispatched to the scene hoped the woman was mistaken, as the situation often turns out to be less severe than the caller describes. But not this time. Several people were waiting for the officers in the parking lot of the apartment complex. One of them stepped forward and led them to the apartment. It was 19-year-old Hugo Ramirez. The young man could barely form sentences due to how much he was crying and shaking. Hugo was about to show the detectives what had shocked him so much. The officers would not soon forget this scene either. Entering the apartment, they walked through an unremarkable living room and kitchen and approached a small hallway. Hugo pointed to the bedroom at the very end on the left. Even before stepping into the room, the officers were stunned by the sight that met their eyes. The drying blood was everywhere, on the carpet, on the belongings, and of course, on the girl lying in the center of this bloody scene. Hugo informed them that the girl's name was Brianna Schneller. Brianna lay on her back, her mutilated face covered with a towel. There were deep wounds on her neck and across the upper part of her torso. Cuts on her arms indicated that she had fought for her life, but the killer had overpowered her. Now the police needed to hurry. Journalists were already surrounding the crime scene, and it was crucial that Brianna's loved ones did not learn of her death from the news. By the time the officers contacted the Schneller family, they already knew something had happened at the apartment where the girl lived and that someone had died. But they didn't know that Brianna was the victim. Her parents had been trying to reach her without success. They were informed of the news at the station. Afterward, they were asked to identify Brianna from photographs taken at the crime scene. Even after confirming it was her parents, Craig and Lori, and her brother Rocky, still couldn't believe what had happened. Despite their unspeakable sorrow, the family members tried to provide the police with as much information as possible about Brianna and the details of her life leading up to the murder. Craig and Lori explained that Brianna's life was much like that of her peers. She was finishing school, working part-time as a waitress in a restaurant, and enjoyed spending her free time with friends. She loved shopping, dancing, and music. Moreover, Brianna was looking forward to a trip to Tennessee that summer, where she was to present an important project for a renowned non-profit national organization of professional and technical student leaders. Brianna was the only person in the entire state of Wisconsin who met all the criteria to participate in this event. To the family, what had happened made no sense. As Craig explained, she didn't have a single enemy. Her relationship with her boyfriend, 22-year-old Sebastian Ramirez, Hugo's brother, was wonderful. The couple had met a couple of years ago and had been inseparable since. During this time, the parents had gotten to know the young man well. Naturally, they had concerns when Brianna decided to move in with him at 18. They worried that she was growing up too fast. But Sebastian truly loved their daughter, so they accepted her decision. After high school, she planned to pursue higher education in restaurant management and dreamed of opening a restaurant with Sebastian. She genuinely enjoyed working in the restaurant business, and she was loved by her colleagues and customers. The girl's parents also helped the police narrow down the time frame of the attack on Brianna. Her mother, Lori, was the last person to speak with Brianna a few hours before the body was discovered. That day, Lori had taken her daughter's car to the auto shop to fix the brakes and had texted her daughter at 10 a.m. Thus, the attack occurred sometime after Lori spoke with her daughter at 10 a.m. and before Hugo found her at 1:30 p.m. While the detectives were speaking with the girl's parents, forensic experts found several clues at the crime scene. First of all, an iron lying on the floor near Brianna caught their attention. Various parts of it were scattered on the floor, and there was blood on the iron, suggesting the killer might have used it as a weapon. In the bathroom sink were two knives, one of which was missing its sharp tip. Blood was found on a bar of soap nearby, indicating that the killer had taken the time to wash the knives and their hands, but had missed leaving a bloody shoe print on the mat. Further examination of the apartment revealed two more interesting points. First, there were no signs of forced entry, and second, nothing seemed to be missing. This was especially curious because cash was scattered throughout the apartment. Various bills ranging from $1 to $20 added up to a considerable sum. If a robber had broken in for money, they would have taken it. Thus, the evidence at the crime scene indicated that Brianna herself was the target of the attack. The autopsy confirmed this conclusion. The most crucial information the medical examiner shared with the detectives was that the girl had fought for her life, and the killer's DNA likely remained under her nails. Skin samples found under her nails were sent for analysis. Overall, the autopsy confirmed what the investigators already suspected. The attack was unprecedented in its brutality and the attacker's fury. Brianna had been struck on the head with a blunt object, likely the iron found near her body. The attacker also slashed her throat with a knife and inflicted so many stab wounds that the pathologist couldn't accurately count them. The knife wounds were particularly severe, and at least 2 of them were fatal enough to kill her within a minute. The tip of one of the knives found in the sink was discovered in one of her wounds. Usually, such a savage attack indicates that the killer must have felt uncontrollable rage towards the victim to inflict so many injuries. But who could have harbored such strong feelings toward Brianna? The police knew of at least one person they needed to speak with immediately. Sebastian was brought to the station along with his brother, but they were placed in separate interrogation rooms so their statements could be compared later. Sebastian explained that he woke up around 9:15 a.m., an hour before he was due at the Mexican restaurant where he and his brother worked. The restaurant, Tequila Salsa, was about 3 kilometers from the apartment, a 10-minute drive. The young man took a shower and chatted with Brianna, as she didn't need to go to school on Saturdays. Hugo had overslept, so his brother had to wake him up just before leaving the house at 10 a.m. By 10:15 a.m., Sebastian was already at work and was there when he received the call informing him about what had happened to his girlfriend. Hugo's story began much like his brother's version. After being woken up by his brother, he quickly got ready and left the house 15 minutes after Sebastian. Nothing unusual happened at work. At 1:20 p.m., Hugo went on a break and drove home to take a short nap. Entering the apartment, he initially didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. He walked down the hallway and into his room, but he soon felt uncomfortable as if something was wrong. That's when he noticed that Sebastian's room door was open. Hugo peeked inside and to his horror saw Brianna lying on the floor. Rushing over, Hugo started shouting her name, begging her to get up, to wake up, but she didn't respond. Only then did he notice how much blood there was in the room. He tried to dial 911, but his mind suddenly stopped working and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even press the buttons. He then ran downstairs, where through his panic he tried to explain to a neighbor that they needed to call for help. The young men seemed genuinely devastated by what had happened. Investigators wanted to believe them, but they knew they needed evidence to confirm their innocence. It was possible they were simply excellent actors, or were hiding remorse beneath a mask of grief and pain. Since both brothers' stories were identical, detectives considered the possibility that one of them committed the crime and the other was covering for him. In such a scenario, Sebastian seemed to have a potential motive to kill Brianna. Officers questioned the brothers about their relationship with Brianna, whether there were any issues, quarrels, or jealousy. Sebastian categorically denied any problems and stuck to his story. Brianna was the love of his life, and they were looking forward to a happy future together. Hugo was questioned with even greater scrutiny, especially after it was revealed he was supposed to work until 3 p.m. that day, but had changed his break time with a colleague due to a hangover, wanting to go home and rest. Detectives wanted to know if anything had happened between him and Brianna. Were there arguments? Perhaps Hugo also had romantic feelings for her, but Sebastian proved to be a more successful rival. However, Hugo vehemently denied this. Brianna was like a sister to him. He knew how deeply she and Sebastian loved each other, and he would never stand in their way. These interrogations continued for hours, but no matter what the police asked, Hugo and Sebastian stood by their stories. However, the brothers were able to clarify the issue of the scattered money found throughout the apartment. It was Hugo's tips. Previously, he used to carefully count all the money, but lately he had become lazy. When he came home, he simply emptied his pockets wherever, always promising himself to deal with it later. After obtaining DNA samples from the brothers, They were released, but in the eyes of the detectives, they remained the only suspects in Brianna's murder. Therefore, their next task was to either confirm or disprove the brothers' testimonies. Colleagues from the Mexican restaurant El Tequila Salsa confirmed that the young men were at work. Moreover, the restaurant had surveillance cameras, including ones that recorded the kitchen area. After reviewing the footage, the police confirmed that Sebastian arrived at work first at 10:13 a.m. and did not leave until after Brianna's body was discovered. Hugo arrived at work a few minutes later and took his break at 1:20 p.m., just as he had stated. At the same time, the detectives were following another lead. Their conclusion that nothing had been stolen from the apartment had been hasty. Although the money and valuables were indeed left behind, the police had not found Brianna's phone. Like any teenage girl, Brianna always kept her phone with her. Moreover, she had exchanged messages with her mother at 10 a.m., so she definitely had it with her before the murder. This greatly interested the police, as the phone could contain something crucial to solving her murder. Therefore, the detectives made finding the phone their priority. They contacted Brianna's service provider. The phone company pinged the device and not only found that it was on, but also pinpointed its exact location. The detectives took one look at the address and were stunned. They knew this place. More than that, they had just been there. The phone was located near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant, where the brothers Sebastian and Hugo worked. The detectives rushed to the location to find and seize the device as quickly as possible. Upon arrival, they realized that the coordinates were not for the restaurant itself, but for the parking lot of the shopping center where the restaurant was located. The police soon narrowed down the search area to the section where the dumpsters were. The detectives were reluctant to sift through all the garbage bags and had a simple yet brilliant idea. They called the phone, opening the dumpsters one by one. Finally, they heard the ringtone. Carefully moving the contents of the dumpster, the officers saw a light-colored bag through which the phone's screen light was visible. The bag contained several items, not just the phone. The police were eager to open it, but had to send it to the lab first because it could have DNA on it, especially on the top where someone had carefully twisted it closed. However, the detectives could already make one conclusion. This was not an ordinary bag, but a bag with the logo of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant, which customers used for takeout orders. The circle around the brothers was tightening more and more. Of course, they seemed to have an alibi, but the investigators couldn't believe that anyone else had committed the murder. Moreover, the pathologist couldn't determine the exact time of the girl's death to the minute. What if the crime happened a little earlier than they assumed? The girl had communicated with her mother at 10 a.m. Immediately after that, one of the brothers, or even both, killed Brianna, quickly got ready, and showed up at work at 10:15 a.m. Then they threw the bag with the evidence into the trash bin near the restaurant, hoping no one would find it. After the forensic experts collected DNA samples from the bag, it could finally be opened. Inside, in addition to Brianna's phone, there were warm gloves, but from different pairs, with one of them stained with blood, and also women's underwear, 2 pairs of panties. The investigators had expected anything, but not this. They had more questions than answers. According to Sebastian, the underwear belonged to Brianna. One of the gloves likely had been taken from the apartment as well. However, these items contradicted all the theories the detectives had been considering. If Hugo or Sebastian had committed the crime, it would be absurd for them to take the girl's underwear. But Sebastian and Hugo did not kill the girl. After examining Brianna's phone, investigators saw that her last conversation was not with her mother, but with a friend. Brianna sent her last message at 10:23, when the brothers had already definitely arrived at the restaurant, as confirmed by surveillance cameras. The entire investigation turned upside down. The police had never considered any other suspects besides the Ramirez brothers, but it turned out that both were completely innocent. So, who was the killer? And why did they dispose of the bag with evidence right near the El Tequila Salsa restaurant? Now, the detectives had to add a multitude of names to their list of suspects, employees and patrons of the El Tequila Salsa restaurant. They considered it highly unlikely that someone unrelated to the restaurant killed Brianna, collected incriminating evidence, and disposed of it right near the restaurant. Therefore, they first reviewed the list of employees, and one name caught their attention: Luciano Sanchez Ramos. The young man worked as a dishwasher at the restaurant and lived in the same building as Brianna. But most importantly, he was home on the morning of the murder. He arrived at work half an hour after Brianna sent her last message to her friend. When the police brought him in for questioning, he did not show much willingness to talk. Perhaps this was due to his immigration status or just a general distrust of the police. Nevertheless, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The detective asked if anyone could verify his alibi, even partially. Luciano said there was someone, his colleague, the restaurant's cook Raul, who gave him a ride to work. The police spoke with Raul, who confirmed that he picked up Luciano. Raul honked his horn, and within a couple of minutes, Luciano came out of the house, behaving as usual. The investigators wanted some reliable confirmation of this and hoped that surveillance cameras might reveal what Luciano did that morning. Did he really just go to work at 11 a.m., or did he stop by the dumpster to dispose of the evidence? Unfortunately, all the restaurant's cameras filmed only inside the establishment. However, there was a gas station across from the dumpsters that had its own surveillance cameras. The quality of the footage left much to be desired, and the dumpsters were far from the gas station. Still, these videos provided invaluable help to the investigation. On May 9th, the police finally finished reviewing all the footage from the restaurant and the parking lot where the dumpsters were located. Individually, these videos were not very useful, but when the detectives correlated the timestamps, they obtained a much clearer picture of what had happened. At 1:16 p.m., one person exited through the restaurant's back door. Simultaneously, only one person approached the dumpster. It was 22-year-old restaurant cook Raul Ponce-Rocha. He threw away the trash, quickly returned to the restaurant kitchen, and washed his hands. What was even more interesting was that Raul was the only one who left the restaurant during the time frame when Brianna's murder was committed. At 10:21 a.m., just a few minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived at work, he exited through the back door to go pick up Luciano and returned at 10:56 a.m. Notably, he left wearing a brown hoodie but returned without it. He confirmed that he and Luciano did not make any stops on their way back to work. The detectives asked him why he was gone for 35 minutes when the trip to pick up Luciano should have taken a maximum of 20 minutes. Where did the extra 15 minutes go? Raul was surprisingly stubborn and did not attempt to explain. The detective then asked about the cuts on his hands. Raul explained that as a cook, he frequently handled knives and had cut himself about 3 weeks ago, although the cuts looked fresh. While the investigators were confident that they had the right suspect, one question continued to trouble them. Why did Raul attack Brianna, and with such brutality? After all, he barely knew her. The Ramirez brothers had always treated him well, considering him a jovial fellow who often told funny stories and never had any quarrels with them. But detectives soon found the answer to this question. The police had enough evidence to obtain a DNA sample from Raul and a search warrant for the house where he lived with his parents and brothers. To prevent him from fleeing, they detained him based on his illegal immigration status. During the search of his bedroom, police found a glove that matched the one found in the dumpster, a sweatshirt with strands of hair that could belong to Brianna, and, finally, under the mattress, several adult videos and 4 pairs of women's panties. Everything fell into place when officers remembered Brianna's mother Lori's words about how she had taken her daughter's car to the auto repair shop that day. On the morning of May 2, 2009, Raul arrived at the restaurant around 9 a.m. On his way, he passed by the house where the girl lived and noticed that her car was not in its usual spot. He made a fatal mistake, assuming she wasn't home. Knowing that Hugo and Sebastian would soon arrive for work, he decided it was a perfect opportunity to add to his modest collection and steal something from Brianna's belongings. Just minutes after the Ramirez brothers arrived for work, Raul left, got into his car, and under the pretext of picking up Luciano, headed to the girl's house. He didn't immediately signal Luciano and instead went into the apartment where the brothers and Brianna lived. The lock on the apartment door was not very secure and could easily be opened with a plastic card. He entered the apartment. If the girl had caught him in the act, Raul could have claimed he was looking for the brothers and that the door was open. But most likely, the girl caught him stealing her underwear. Realizing she could identify him, Raul panicked, first hitting her with an iron and then slashing her throat with a knife, inflicting several other wounds. Detectives speculate that he began to derive pleasure from the process. Otherwise, it's unclear why he would strike her multiple times with 2 knives. After the murder, he quickly tried to clean up and took the evidence with him, as he still needed to pick up Luciano. He then returned to work as if nothing had happened and disposed of the evidence packet. All doubts about Raul's involvement disappeared when the lab results arrived. His DNA was found on the knife, the packet, the gloves, the iron, and under Brianna's fingernails. The hair on his sweatshirt also belonged to the victim. Furthermore, a blood-stained shoe print in the bathroom matched the size and pattern of Raul's shoes that he wore on the day of the murder. Raul was charged with Brianna's murder. The trial began in 2011. Initially, during interrogations, Raul claimed he had never spoken to Brianna and never entered the house where she lived. However, by the start of the trial, his story changed. Despite almost pinning the murder on Sebastian and Hugo, Raul showed no remorse and decided to accuse an innocent third person of the crime. He claimed that he had entered the apartment but left, leaving behind his colleague Sergio Juarez Gutierrez, who Brianna was discussing something with in another room. This statement could have planted doubts in the minds of the jurors because Sergio hastily left for Mexico, and Raul's lawyers were confident they wouldn't be able to question him. However, the police managed to contact Sergio in Mexico, and he was not pleased to hear that his name had been dragged through the mud. He returned for the trial and proved that he was nowhere near Brianna on the day of the murder. Sergio had returned to Mexico shortly before the murder to take care of his father, who had cancer. No one expected Sergio to appear in court, and it was a serious blow to the defendant's defense. It took the jurors only 90 minutes to find Raul guilty of first-degree murder, robbery, and theft. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Thus, a young woman lost her life due to a tragic mistake. Raul did not enter the apartment with the intention of killing her. But why did he choose murder instead of being charged with unlawful entry? Was he afraid of being deported? That everyone would find out about his collection? Or did he simply not realize the consequences of his actions? Did he cover Brianna's face with a towel, unable to face what he had done? Brianna's father admitted that he wanted to talk to Raul, perhaps to ask him all these questions. However, Raul declined his offer to meet. He never took responsibility for the crime. His decision was based solely on the assumption that Brianna wasn't home. After the trial, Lori Schneller said that the verdict wouldn't bring back her daughter, but would allow them to live on. "We are glad that justice was served for her," she said. "I don't know if there will ever be a day like before, but it has become a little easier after the verdict." The meeting went well. Janine smiled satisfactorily. She was sitting in the car with her friend Becky and a new acquaintance introduced to her by Becky. Janine was facing difficulties with her rapidly growing real estate business, and the man was supposed to help her. They met in the car due to the busy schedule of the women and to drive by and discuss one of the houses owned by Janine's real estate agency. They agreed on everything, and Janine was sure that the rough patch would soon be over. She would go on a cruise, and when she returned, work would fall into place, and she would receive $1 million, which she would put into new projects. Smiling happily in anticipation of change, Janine opened the car door and stepped out into the parking lot. But before she could take a few steps, she realized that none of her dreams were meant to come true. Janine Lee Monsell, 28, met Max Jones, 31, in early 1991. It was a fateful encounter. Until then, Janine had been desperately unlucky in love. She had been married twice before and was raising a son on her own. But with Max, everything was different. He was reliable and faithful, and they immediately developed feelings for each other. It only took them a few months to decide that they wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. Janine and Max's wedding took place quite modestly in a local church in October of the same year, 1991. Soon after, their family began to grow. The following summer, their son Zach was born, and 2 years later, their daughter Alexandria, who everyone called Alex, arrived. The family lived modestly, but they managed to make ends meet. Janine tried several jobs. She tried working as a nurse and selling various goods, but her job failures were offset by her husband's stable income. Max was not only talented, but also hardworking as a carpenter. His skills were highly valued, and he was never idle. Moreover, he never turned down extra work, and although the family didn't live extravagantly, they stayed afloat. The couple lived in a modest house in Northport, Florida, where they raised their children, attended church, and participated in the local community. They had many friends, were loved and respected by their neighbors, and seemed genuinely happy together. But soon, the situation took a sharp turn. In 1997, Janine got a job as a guard in a prison, but it led to a huge scandal. She engaged in a romantic relationship with an inmate, and after someone complained about their relationship, they were caught in the act, so to speak. Their prolonged affair was confirmed when letters from Janine to her lover were found in the inmate's cell. Though they were signed with a different name, it wasn't hard to establish their true author. To prevent further scandal and numerous interrogations, Janine resigned. But secrets are hard to keep, and rumors quickly reached her husband. Janine and Max had a falling out. It was a double blow for Max. Firstly, his wife had been unfaithful to him. Secondly, she had once again lost a job that provided a decent supplement to the family, which was barely making ends meet financially. The couple decided not to split up for the sake of their children, but trust was lost forever. They tried to pretend that everything was still the same, but longtime friends saw through the facade. It was just for show. One of the close individuals to the family was John Chamberlain. He met the couple at church, and since then, the two hard-working men, Max, working as a carpenter, and John, a locksmith, became best friends. Over the years, John observed how the spouses drifted apart. Janine and Max lived together, but besides their children and property, they had nothing in common. But gradually, even though love had long vanished from their relationship, the situation more or less stabilized. The children grew up, and each of the spouses socialized with their own circle of friends. In 2011, Max began to suffer from stomach problems, which led to a significant weight loss and multiple hospitalizations. However, doctors were at a loss and couldn't find the cause of his illness. Prior to this, he had never complained about health issues. The family did everything possible to alleviate Max's condition, hoping that doctors would soon understand what was wrong. But they were completely unprepared for how it would all end. Just 3 days after Thanksgiving in 2011, the family found Max near death. He was lying in bed, pale and unresponsive. Janine called 911. The dispatcher instructed her on how to administer first aid to Max, and Alexandria followed the instructions. Unfortunately, Max passed away in his daughter's arms. Paramedics arrived minutes later, but they couldn't do anything to help. Max died from a heart attack at the age of 52. Family and friends were shocked by his sudden death. They knew he was ill, but they thought it was related to his stomach. The news of the heart attack came as a thunderbolt out of the blue. It was very difficult for Zach and Alexandria, who were 19 and 17 years old respectively, to cope with the loss of their father. Nevertheless, a doctor signed the death certificate, and Max was cremated 2 days later. Now, it was up to Janine to provide for the family. Considering her previous employment difficulties, it seemed like an insurmountable task for her. But to everyone's surprise, she not only managed but also significantly improved the family's financial situation. Of course, a big help was the $1 million insurance payout she received after her husband's death. But she didn't just sit on it. Using the money, she opened a real estate agency and began renovating and renting out homes. Like many cities in the USA, Northport experienced a real estate boom in the early 2000s. But the 2008 crisis hit the real estate sector hard, and many homes were foreclosed by banks. They stood abandoned, waiting for new owners. These homes became an opportunity for someone like Janine, who had the money to take advantage of the situation. Naturally, Janine also found herself and her children a better place to live. Explaining her actions by the need to move on, she sold the house and all of her late husband's belongings, including his musical and work tools, which he cherished dearly. But it didn't stop there. She began spending a lot of time with her new friend Becky. She drank, used drugs, and spent money on travels, cars, and even a second home in the Great Smoky Mountains area in Tennessee. To those who knew her behavioral changes seemed astonishing. It seemed strange to acquaintances that one could forget a husband with whom Janine had spent 20 years so quickly. Finally, changes awaited Janine in her personal life as well, when she met Matthew Riley Smith, a cable television installation technician. Matthew was only 26 years old. He was half Janine's age and only a few years older than her son. Nevertheless, in July 2012, Janine announced to everyone that she and Matthew had married during a recent trip to Las Vegas. Zach and Alexandria didn't like that their mother had remarried so hastily, especially considering that Max had passed away less than a year ago. They tried not to conflict with Matthew because he hadn't done anything wrong to them, but they disapproved of their mother's eagerness to move on so quickly. Nevertheless, Matthew Smith became a part of Janie Ain's personal life and business, but Matthew's help turned out to be insufficient. In fact, the business was so successful that Janine soon needed an employee, and she turned to her old friend, John Chamberlain. Besides being a locksmith, he had many other skills necessary for home repairs. Janine offered John a job with the condition that he and his 11-year-old daughter would live in one of her houses and pay a very low rent. It was a lucrative offer, and John agreed. Everything went well for a few months, but soon doubts began to creep into the man's mind. John Chamberlain was particularly troubled by the number of houses where all his work involved drilling the lock on the front door. Janine reassured him that this was just a routine part of the job. Since the houses had been empty for a long time, there was no way to contact the previous owners and obtain keys. But John wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Nevertheless, he continued to do repairs for Janine, not taking any action, until one significant moment. His worst fears were confirmed when he answered a call from one of Janine's tenants. The tenant told him that a stranger had just knocked on their door and inquired about what they were doing in his house. To get to the bottom of the situation, John gave the tenant Janine's personal number. Within minutes, she called him back and was furious. John told her that if she was involved in something illegal, he didn't want to be a part of it. In response, she ordered him to vacate the house and sent Matt to deliver the message in person. The encounter between the men ended in a fight. Janine sent John an eviction notice, but he refused to leave, and the matter went to civil court. Additionally, John went to the police. He met with detectives and told them about his involvement in Janine's business, which he believed to be illegal. They listened carefully and said they believed his suspicions. This encouraged him to also share suspicions about the death of Max Jones. Despite Max's stomach problems, his heart attack came as a surprise, and it seemed that Janine wasn't grieving at all. She had remarried a younger man and was living a luxurious lifestyle. But what troubled him the most was that Janine had cremated Max within 2 days of his death without allowing an autopsy, and she found no better way to deal with Max's ashes than to hand the urn to John. Thanks to John Chamberlain's tip-off, the police began monitoring Janine, hoping to learn more about her suspicious business and the death of her third husband. And the police found something. Although Janine and Matt were renovating and renting out properties, they had no connection to any of these houses. They hadn't purchased them or obtained ownership rights to rent them out. Janine would go to the tax assessor's office and file documents formally renouncing her rights to the properties, but with a forged signature. Considering she was renovating and spending large sums of money on the houses, who wouldn't believe they belonged to her? All that was left was to drill the locks, tidy up the house a bit, and it could be rented out. She deceived unsuspecting people out of tens of thousands of dollars, and she even gave them a prepaid phone number to avoid leaving any traces to her. So she was enraged when Jon gave the tenants her real phone number. Her business was a scam from start to finish. Furthermore, Janine didn't have a license to work as a realtor. But that was just the beginning of the investigation. The screws were tightening around Janine, and she made a desperate attempt to get free. Although it's unknown for certain if Janine knew that Jon had gone to the police, she decided that the legal proceedings with him posed enough of a threat to her business to take action. Whom did she decide to turn to with her problem? Of course, to her best friend Becky. She told her that Jon was too informed about her affairs, and the court proceedings were costing her too much money, so they needed to deal with him. Becky promised to help. She had acquaintances, not always acting within the law, and one of them could help solve this sensitive issue. On February 20th, 2013, Becky and Janine met for lunch at a restaurant to discuss the details. They needed to make sure they understood their plan before Becky introduced her friend to her acquaintance. During lunch, Janine described Jon Chamberlain's appearance, gave his address, and even drew a schematic of the house on a napkin with indications of the best points from which to enter. Janine insisted that the matter needed to be resolved as quickly as possible. She planned to go on a cruise and wanted to ensure she wasn't in town during the murder to have an alibi. Becky promised to pass the information to the hitman and 5 days later organized a meeting with him. On February 25th, Becky and Janine met with the executor, got into his car, and discussed the final details. Janine handed the man a photo of John Chamberlain and said it would be preferable to break his neck to keep the crime scene clean. In the worst case, he could be shot. The main thing was to get rid of the body. As she added, if the body can't be found, nothing can be proven. They drove past John's house where she explained how to break in and warned about any possible threats, such as the man's 11-year-old daughter. Waving her hand, she stated that the girl didn't concern her, and if she got in the way, they should deal with her too. The important thing was that her body wasn't found either. The driver stopped the car in the parking lot and at some point asked Becky to step out of the car to discuss the final details of the matter alone with Janine. As if the random victim in the form of an 11-year-old girl wasn't horrifying enough, by the end of the meeting, Janine made another chilling proposition. She asked if she could get 2 for the price of 1. She was tired of her 4th husband, Matthew Smith, and wished to rid herself of the burden and threat. Just on January 3rd, his life insurance policy worth $1 million came into effect, and he would be more useful to her dead than alive. Janine proposed getting rid of him a couple of weeks after John. But in his case, it was harder to accomplish because he might have a weapon on him, and there were surveillance cameras in the house. She suggested staging his murder as a carjacking. The killer agreed to all her terms, and she agreed to pay $4,000 for each man. She brought $1,000 with her, ready to hand it over immediately to confirm her seriousness of intentions. When the meeting was over, a satisfied Janine got out of the car. Seconds later, she was surrounded by police officers and arrested. Her initial fear and shock quickly turned to anger as she realized she had fallen into a classic police trap. For the past few weeks, she had been the subject of an investigation under the codename Black Widow, and it was all because John wasn't the only one who went to the police. Janine's best friend, Becky, was also cooperating with the detectives. While she did have connections in the city's underworld, she chose to take a different path. An informant called the police, reporting that his friend wanted to report a planned contract killing. This friend turned out to be Becky. When they were discussing the murder details in the restaurant and Janine was drawing the victim's house plan, Becky had a microphone and camera on her. In the car, she introduced Janine to Officer Dominic Harris, who of course recorded the entire conversation. The man needed Janine to do several things that would later help convict her. He needed Janine to provide a photo of John Chamberlain. She had to show where he lived. She had to say how she wanted him to be killed. They needed to discuss the cost of the hit. He needed Janine to give money for the murder. The man played his role perfectly, even though it was difficult for him to hide his shock and disgust when Janine casually dismissed John's daughter as a nuisance and later talked about Matt's murder. Janine was charged with 2 counts of solicitation to commit murder and faced 33 charges related to her business, ranging from robbery to criminal use of personal information and operating as a realtor without proper authorization. Her husband, Matt Smith, was horrified when he was told that his wife had planned to have him killed. He himself was arrested on March 15, 2013. Initially, he was reluctant to cooperate, but the 30 charges of fraud persuaded Matt, and he offered to testify against Janine. In exchange for his testimony against his wife, he was offered a great deal. In January 2014, after spending 6 months in prison, he pleaded guilty to only 1 charge. He was sentenced to 4 years of probation and ordered to pay $17,500 to the victims of their scam. However, Matt never got to testify in court. In May 2014, Janine announced that she didn't want to contest the charge. This means that she doesn't admit guilt, but is willing to accept the punishment that the judge will impose. Janine claimed that her impulsive decision to hire a hitman was influenced by drugs and alcohol, and that she was not a danger to society. However, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Of course, the police tried to investigate her involvement in the death of Max Jones. When John Chamberlain approached the police, they listened carefully to him and didn't dismiss his words because they had heard the name Janine Jones before. They had witness statements claiming that Janine Jones had approached them to obtain drugs that, in their opinion, were used to kill Max. However, in the state of Florida, if a doctor signs a death certificate stating that the death occurred due to natural causes, an autopsy cannot be performed. Not to mention that the quick cremation of the body deprived the police of any evidence. Officially, Max Jones died of a heart attack. As prophetically stated by Janine herself, if there's no body, you can't prove anything. Unfortunately, she was right about that. Nevertheless, Max's loved ones believe that it is right for her to spend the rest of her life in prison. During Janine's sentencing, John Chamberlain sat next to Max's father. When the judge rendered her decision and said that Janine would never be released, Max's father turned to John, placed his hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for achieving justice for my boy." On Tuesday, February 11, 1997, Le Portel, a small town on the southern coast of Boulogne-sur-Mer, was celebrating its carnival for 3 days. The festival was in full swing, and tonight was the last night that everyone was eagerly anticipating. The Merlin sisters, Peggy and Amelie, had never missed it. Today, they invited their friends Isabel and Audrey Raffin. The girls met 5 months ago. 16-year-old Amelie and 17-year-old Audrey became friends at school after the Raffin sisters moved to Le Portel. Soon they became inseparable, just like their older sisters, 20-year-old Peggy and Isabel. The girls spent the entire half of the day getting ready. Everything had to be perfect for the carnival evening. Finally, they were ready. Peggy transformed into a marquise, Amelie into Pierrot, Audrey chose a musketeer costume, and Isabel turned into an Indian. Their older sister Virginia joined Audrey and Isabel. At 8:30 p.m., the 5 girls left the house to walk to the square where the festival was taking place. Despite the cold and rain that evening, all 5 were in a great mood. The friends sang and danced together with everyone. People in carnival costumes gathered from all sides. Meeting their friends, they briefly stopped at a cafe to warm up. At 11:30 p.m., it was time to go down to the Partel beach to see the highlight of the show, the burning of Batista, a rag doll. This was the highlight that Peggy and Amelie wanted to show Audrey and Isabel. A huge bonfire had already been prepared on the beach. At midnight, the rag doll burned out, and as tradition requires, all carnival participants head to the village of Equien, located 3 kilometers to the south. 2 hours before that, the girls agreed to meet their friend Eve halfway and go together. But the young man never saw the girls. He decided that they had changed their minds and went to warm up at Peggy and Amelie's. In reality, there was no reason for Eve to worry since many people gathered at the carnival, and the townspeople in carnival costumes continued to walk back and forth between Partel and Equien. Morning came. The carnival was over and Peggy's and Amelie's mother came to the main square to pick them up. Marie-José Merlin bought croissants to have a snack with her daughters and listen to their stories about the evening, but they didn't show up at the meeting place. The woman returned home around 7:30 a.m., woke up Virginia and asked where the girls were and why they hadn't returned yet. Virginia replied that the carnival ends at 6 to 7 a.m. and they need more time to get back, or they might have stayed overnight at Isabel and Audrey's. Meanwhile, Isabel and Audrey's mother was also starting to get nervous. She had let her daughters go to the carnival and worried that they hadn't returned yet, but thought they had stayed overnight at Marie-José's. As time went on, and when the two mothers spoke on the phone, it turned out that neither of them had seen the girls. None of their friends or relatives knew where they were. Anxiety was growing. It was not like the girls to disappear like this. They always let their families know if they were going to be late. At 9 o'clock in the evening, driven mad with worry, the parents went to the police station. But to their deep disappointment, the police officers were not at all concerned. The girls were at an age when they could relax and forget about everything, especially during the carnival season. The police officers assumed that there was a carnival in the neighboring town and the girls went there to have fun. In other words, the girls' disappearance amounted to a simple escape. However, the parents knew for sure that they would not have run away in carnival costumes without money and documents. Moreover, they were very attached to their mothers. Marie-José Merlin had recently suffered a heart attack and the daughters were afraid to do anything that could upset their mother. Isabel and Audrey were also attached to their foster mother, Loa. The woman had adopted Audrey, Isabel, and their older sister Virginia after their mother's death when the girls were 3, 4, and 6 years old. The girls appreciated the love that surrounded them and would not have run away. Convinced that there was no point in running away and faced with the lack of reaction from the police, the relatives organized the search themselves. They began to post flyers around the city, searched the lighthouse, beaches, and abandoned bunkers built during World War II, and even inspected the abandoned tunnel of the city. The family even approached the boats moored at the pier and locked on them, assuming that the girls could be locked inside. In a cafe, they found a souvenir photo of Audrey in a musketeer costume, which confirmed that they were at the carnival. But for the next 48 hours, there was no other news about the girls. Then, thanks to flyers, calls from witnesses began to come to the Lamotte family's home. People confirmed that they had seen the girls in Portel and remembered 4 outfits. But after the crowd headed to Equain, no one saw them. What is even more disturbing, witnesses reported a white van with white stripes, the passengers of which were staring at the walkers, following them, and generally behaving suspiciously. They also attracted increased attention because on that carnival evening, they were without costumes. This was a very interesting lead, but the police continued to adhere to the version of the escape. Families who were tired of hearing the same excuses decided to alert the press. Fortunately, journalists did not believe the escape version, and on Sunday, February 16th, an article appeared in the local newspaper. The journalist mentioned the van with green stripes. Reporters from all over the country picked up the story. Faced with pressure from the media, the prosecutor finally acknowledged that the escape may not be the only version of what happened. After 6 days of the girls' disappearance, the investigation started from scratch. The police quickly confirmed that a specific van was spotted on the night of the carnival and found witnesses, a family of 2, who reported the car's license plate number. At the same time, another call came into Laura's house. The woman reported that the wanted van was located in a neighboring village. According to the woman, it belonged to 2 scrap metal dealers who were well known in the village for their crimes. The woman added that they needed to hurry because the brothers were already repainting the van. With the license plate number, the police also identified the brothers as Jean-Michel and Jean-Louis Jordan. Could the brothers be the kidnappers of the 4 girls? It turned out that the brothers were long known to law enforcement. They grew up almost uneducated in completely unsuitable conditions for normal life. These people lived separately from society. According to rumors, their mother practiced incestuous relations with her sons, and their father was an aggressive alcoholic. 38-year-old Jean-Louis is the eldest in the family. He suffers from developmental abnormalities, was convicted of harassing girls, and spent 1.5 years behind bars. Barely released from prison, he received 10 years for violence against a girl but was released after 5. His brother Jean-Michel's criminal career is even more impressive. At 15, he attacked a 12-year-old girl so fiercely that he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, which is rare. After his release from prison, when his wife was preparing to become a mother, he killed his ex-girlfriend, 18-year-old Anita Dassonville. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison but was released after 9. Jean-Michel was married and had 3 children, one of whom, young Jennifer, died of meningitis. His second wife described him as a great husband and caring father, an opinion that was not shared by many. Those around him considered him a bundle of nerves with muscles. If young girls fell into the hands of the brothers, one should beware of the worst. The police had enough of this to interrogate the brothers. On Wednesday, a week after the girls' disappearance, the police carried out a large-scale operation to detain the Jordan brothers. And if they are the ones holding the girls, the slightest mistake could be fatal. Upon arrest, the brothers did not resist, but were surprised by the police's appearance. There were no girls in the house, although what the police saw there horrified them. The house resembled more of a dump, and there was a strong smell of filth. A little boy sat half-naked next to a German shepherd and was eating from a dog bowl. In total, there were 9 people living in the house, including 5 children under the age of 12. The police seized a van. It had been repainted, but what was even worse, the interior had been thoroughly clean. What are the brothers trying to hide? A race against time began for the investigators. They can only detain the brothers for up to 48 hours and need to make them talk, because right now they have suspicions, but absolutely no physical evidence. The brothers insisted in unison that they had not approached the carnival square. However, after the testimony of numerous witnesses was presented to them, they admitted to simply passing by but swore they had not crossed paths with any of the girls. By Friday morning, after the brothers had been in custody for 30 hours, time was running out for the investigators. So they decided to change tactics. The detective knew that the brothers had a younger sister who had disappeared long ago and was likely already dead. Jean-Louis was deeply attached to his sister and had been grieving her loss for a long time. The detective laid out photos of the missing girls and began telling the suspect about each one. He appealed to Jean-Louis' emotions, saying that they had families waiting for them. Although they couldn't save his sister, there was still a chance to help the girls and return them to their families. At these words, Jean-Louis leaned back in his chair, sighed, and declared that the girls were dead and that he was directly involved. He agreed to show where the bodies were buried. Journalists gathered outside the police station watched as the police car raced off in an unknown direction, and they followed. The entire procession stopped at the base of a dew. The police, together with Jean-Louis, went to the spot he had indicated. They had to dig for a very long time, so long that the detectives thought the man had deceived them and that there were no bodies there. Suddenly, a piece of red fabric from one of the musketeer costumes emerged. All 4 girls were lying in a pit measuring 1 by 2 meters. They were wearing carnival costumes that they had worn to the masquerade. On the other side of the dune, impatient journalists saw 4 hearses approaching. They arrived in silence. Then it became clear to them that the hearses were carrying the bodies of the 4 missing friends, and they rushed to report the news to the public. The families of the girls learned of the horrific news from the radio. The missing girls were found, but the nightmare was only beginning. On February 24th, forensic experts conducted an autopsy. They discovered that the perpetrators had chosen strangulation as their method of murder and had sexually assaulted 3 of the victims. Isabel became the first victim. She was severely beaten and then strangled. She likely put up the most resistance to her kidnappers. Peggy was sexually assaulted and then attempted to be strangled. However, she was buried alive. Sand was found in her esophagus, indicating that she was still breathing when she was buried. Amelie was even more beaten than the previous 2 girls. She was sexually assaulted and then killed. Finally, young Audrey was subjected to every kind of violence one can imagine. When Audrey was the last one alive, the perpetrators likely just played with her. Now the police wanted to know how it all happened. But during questioning, the brothers presented conflicting versions that only began the same way. Around 11 p.m., they met 4 girls dressed as musketeers, an Indian, a Marquise, and Piero, and agreed to give them a ride to Ikayan. They only had to drive 3 kilometers, and one of the girls quickly noticed that they had been driving too long and in the wrong direction. They yelled that they wanted to get out. One of the girls tried to open the van door, but it was blocked. According to Jean-Louis, Michel ordered him to calm down the captives, while he himself drove the van even faster. They arrived at Saint-Cécile Beach and brought the captives to an abandoned bunker. These are defensive structures that have survived in France since the war. The bunker has only one exit, which makes it an ideal prison for captives. And this is where the brothers' versions diverge. Jean-Louis said that he was guarding the girls in the blockhouse while Jean-Michel took them one by one. When his brother came for the last captive, Jean-Louis followed them to the top of the dune, where 3 girls were lying motionless on the ground. In his presence, Jean-Michel killed the 4th victim, and they buried the bodies together. Jean-Michel, in turn, admits that he led the victims to the blockhouse, but once inside, he left them in the company of his brother and went back for the keys, which he had left in the van. When he returned, his brother showed him 4 bodies lying on the top of the dune. They buried 2 of them. So, each of the brothers denies violence and murder. The most they did was to help bury the bodies. Without being able to rely on the suspects' statements, the detectives waited for evidence to prove the brothers' involvement in the murder. Forensic experts started with examining the van, which was an ideal trap. The lock on the back door was broken so that it could only be opened from the outside, and the van was cleaned out. However, upon closer inspection, investigators found a piece of an earring, a fragment of Audrey's earring that was torn off of her. This was evidence that the girls were brutally beaten inside the van. The problem was that besides the valuable evidence, the police did not find any DNA evidence of the brothers or the girls. They found some suspicious stains, possibly blood, but they were unable to conduct an analysis. Of course, the brothers cleaned it perfectly, but in 1999, the police did not have modern DNA analysis tools. Therefore, there was very little physical evidence to link the Jordan brothers to the crime. The DNA found on the victims' bodies did not allow for the exact identification of the perpetrator. Learning about this, Jean-Michel used this opportunity to retract his previous statements and deny any involvement in the crime. With minimal evidence and conflicting testimonies, the investigation could only rely on the reconstruction of the crime scene. Jean-Michel refused to cooperate, so the words of Jean-Louis were the only ones that could be verified. He showed the path that he, his brother, and the victims took towards the blackthorn bush. More accurately, they didn't walk, but rather crept because they first had to descend to the beach and then move along the boulders. It is important to remember that it rained on the night of the tragedy, and the tide reached almost to the blackthorn bush. Could 2 brothers lead 4 girls against their will over wet and slippery stones in pitch darkness? But Jean-Louis insists that his brother then escorted each girl to the top of the dune. He describes the order in which his brother led the girls, of course not by name, but by their masquerade costumes. However, in the blackthorn bush, it was pitch dark and the brothers had no flashlight. How could he have seen their costumes? Furthermore, the path he indicates is strewn with even greater obstacles. There is barbed wire on it, on which no piece of fabric was found, although the girls could not have crossed it without tearing their elaborate masquerade costumes. A careful examination of the girls' costumes did not reveal any tears or even snags. After this reconstruction, there were more questions than answers. The main ones being, under what circumstances were the girls killed, and how did the brothers divide the roles between themselves? The psychiatrist who talked to them described them as dangerous predators, especially Jean-Michel. Could either of them have remained hungry? Yet each of them insisted that at most, they helped the other bury the bodies. Now that the investigation is over, the jury will have to decide this dilemma. On October 16, 2002, the trial of the brothers began in St. Amma. During the trial, it became known that a few days before the carnival, the predators were already searching for prey. They almost kidnapped a young woman in Burma. She had been in a phone booth for 19 hours, and her friend was calling from another nearby booth. The girl noticed a van with green stripes that pulled up next to the payphone. The driver, whom she identified as Jean-Michel, stared at her intently when Jean-Louis appeared, ready to pull her inside by force. Luckily, her friend approached at that moment. Jean-Louis saw him, closed the door, and the van drove away. This was not the only similar story that the jurors heard, leading them to believe that the brothers had bought the van specifically for the purpose of kidnapping girls. However, Jean-Louis continued to claim that he had done nothing. It was like talking to a wall when trying to talk to his brother. The prosecutor was worried that the jurors would only accuse Jean-Michel, believing he had played a passive role. Jean-Louis, perhaps unintentionally, was playing a winning game. Therefore, the prosecutor requested that all participants in the trial be taken to the scene of the incident. Such a practice is very rare, but in this case, the prosecution considered it necessary to understand how events unfolded that night. On October 25, 2002, all court participants went to the beach of Saint-Cécile. As expected, the jurors could not even reach the Blackthorn, and you still need to climb to the top of the dune, overcoming a series of barbed wire. It is impossible to make such a journey at night without the victims tearing their clothes and trying to escape. Obviously, the girls were never in Blackthorn. This explains why, despite multiple signs of violence, there was no sand in their intimate areas. In other words, according to the results of the autopsy, the rape could not have occurred on the beach. The prosecutor is sure the violence and murder took place in the van in the presence of two brothers. They put the girls in the van, promising to take them to the beach. When Isabelle realized that they were not going there, she panicked and tried to open the door, but in vain. Jean-Louis beat her fiercely to calm her down. In turn, Jean-Michel parked the van in a secluded corner of the campsite in the dunes, which is deserted at this time of year. The man turned off the engine and joined the girls and brother in the back of the van. The van was the instrument of the murder of the poor girls. It was there, in those horrific conditions, that they were beaten and killed. Peggy's DNA found under Amelie's fingernails provides additional heartbreaking details of the violence. While the girls were being abused, they held onto each other, seeking strength and support from their sister and friend. And then it's simple. You just need to open the door, walk 20 meters, and you'll find yourself at the top of the dune. What we don't know and will never know is what one did and what two did. The exact circumstances of the tragedy may be unclear, but the guilt of the two brothers is not in doubt, because the crime of one brother is so difficult to separate from the villainy of the other. As they prepared for the crime together and spread terror in the surrounding area together, the brothers were dubbed the Siamese Horror Brothers. On October 27, 2002, the verdict was announced. The brothers were sentenced to life imprisonment with maximum supervision for 22 years for Michel and 20 years for Louis. The slight difference is explained by the simple fact that without Louis' confession, the police would still be looking for the girls. To this day, the pain of the families is still very strong. Every year on February 12th, Marie Merlin and her son Gregory return to the beach of Saint-Cécile. It's the place where it all ended for them. Gregory says that today he should be a happy older brother, uncle. Instead, he mourns his sisters, kidnapped from the carnival on a night that was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives. In February 2003, the blockhouse that became a stumbling block in the case was blown up. The police protected the family from an angry mob, but a few days later, arson destroyed the Jordan family's home. Poria Mumnai and Cassandre Bouvier became friends in Paris while studying at the Sorbonne. The girls were passionate about the cultures of other countries, especially Latin America, so they studied the history, social and political movements, and culture of the region. Poria, who was born in Morocco, was 24 years old. After completing her thesis on Argentina, she decided to put aside her books and visit the country she had written about. Cassandra, at the age of 29, was no stranger to traveling the world, so she gladly accepted her friend's invitation. The girls packed their suitcases and embarked on a journey through the countries of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean basin. In July 2011, the friends arrived in Salta. It is a province located in the northwest of Argentina with a very interesting geographical, social, and historical repertoire. The landscapes ranged from snow-capped peaks in the Huesca Plains with a tropical dry climate in the east. The architecture includes churches and cathedrals built during the colonial period, ideal for exploration and study by curious students. However, it is worth noting that, like many provinces in the north of the country and probably throughout Latin America, Salta maintains conservative customs. The influence of the Catholic Church on people's daily lives is significant, and the differences between social classes are pronounced. Politics is controlled by a few influential families who have held power for decades. It is important to mention that as this story unfolds, things will become clearer shortly. On July 15th, Cassandra and Horia checked into a hotel in Salta and set out to explore the sites without unpacking their belongings, as they planned to return to Buenos Aires. Salta is a popular province among tourists, known for its low crime rate and friendly population, especially towards tourists. The main attraction in Salta is the natural reserve called Quebrada de San Lorenzo. At exactly 16:23 on July 15th, the girls purchased tickets to visit the reserve. They decided not to hire a guide and ventured deep into the forest. From Buenos Aires, they were supposed to contact their families and inform them of the next city they planned to visit. However, no word was heard from them. On the 19th, unable to bear the uncertainty, their families reached out to Cassandra and Horia's acquaintances in Argentina and asked them to contact the police. 2 weeks later, a group of tourists from a neighboring town embarked on the same trail as the French girls. They arrived at the reserve quite late in the evening, but it was not unusual in this area. Around 1800 hours, one of the tourists separated from the group to find a secluded spot in the dense undergrowth. There, he noticed something resembling a body. Approaching and confirming that it was indeed a body, he screamed and rushed back to the group to inform them of his discovery. The police arrived at the reserve around 10 p.m. The tourists had not marked the exact location where they found the body, only mentioning that it was near a viewpoint. Therefore, in the darkness and amidst the dense vegetation, the police initially struggled to locate it. Eventually, they found the body, but before they could begin their work, they discovered 2 more victims just a few meters away. It turned out to be the 2 missing French tourists. The police developed several theories, including the possibility that the girls were accidentally shot by a local hunter, as many residents in the area hunt for food. Therefore, the search focused on local residents. The police arrested Francisco Tejeda, who worked as a horseback riding guide for tourists. However, he was released just a few days later as there was no evidence connecting him to the crime. His wife told the press that her husband was arrested solely because they were poor people. The police needed a scapegoat to appease public opinion. Immediately after the discovery of the bodies, the police shared with the press that they had been lying in the forest for about 3 days. Since the girls had kept their tickets to the reserve for the 15th, various theories arose about what could have happened to them during the remaining days when they were reported missing. It was speculated that they might have been kidnapped, held captive somewhere, and then disposed of. However, the police later clarified that the girls were killed 14 days prior, and they had been lying in the reserve near the viewpoint all that time. Due to Cassandra's torn clothing and Yuri's pants and underwear being pulled down to her knees, speculations about violence against the girls emerged. The autopsy confirmed this. The tourists were severely beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot with a .22 caliber firearm. In the reserve, the police found a corresponding shell casing. They concluded that the girls had managed to take a walk and returned to the entrance of the reserve. There were few visitors at that time, the sun was setting, and the weather was not conducive to late walks. Obviously, it was then that the perpetrator or perpetrators approached their victims, with one attacker assaulting Cassandra. After the violence inflicted upon her, the girl was shot in the head while kneeling before her killer. Yuria, who witnessed Cassandra's murder, decided not to give up too easily. A clump of hair remained in her clenched fist, indicating her struggle with at least one assailant. Then, according to investigators' assumptions, the girl dashed down the slope from the height when she was caught by a bullet. It hit her in the back, passing through her shoulder. The culprits left, believing that Uriah was also finished. However, she was still alive and attempted to crawl back to the trail. Nevertheless, her attempts were unsuccessful as she was too weak and endured several more hours of agony before succumbing to blood loss. The investigators examined the girl's hotel room and found only one phone among their belongings, instead of the expected two. By determining the location of Uriah's phone, they discovered that a local girl named Maria Fernanda Canizares, the daughter of a former police officer, was using it. They also found Uriah's camera in her possession. The girl claimed that these were gifts from her boyfriend, Gustavo Lossi. Gustavo, 23 years old, worked as a guide in the reserve, and his father sold tickets to tourists. It was Gustavo who had offered his services to the French girls, but they declined. Gustavo had changed the SIM card in the phone, thinking that would be enough to avoid detection. Not immediately, but Gustavo Lossi confessed to being present at the crime scene and participating in the violence. However, he claimed that he was not the instigator or the killer of the French girls, but merely a witness. He recounted that upon hearing noise and running to the screams, he witnessed two men, 24-year-old Daniel Vilt, a stonemason, and 31-year-old Santos Clemente Vera, a gardener from the San Lorenzo plain, tormenting the girls. Supposedly, these men coerced him into participating in the violence and then allowed him to leave. However, he didn't forget to take the girl's phone and camera with him. However, during a search of Gustavo's home, the police discovered the weapon that fired the fatal shots. Uriah's camera helped the police establish the exact time of the attack on the French girls. The girls were enjoying sightseeing and took several photos just before embarking on a hike through the reserve. 2 hours and 5 minutes later, at 6:28 p.m., the tourists took their last photo, which turned out blurry and unclear, allowing investigators to speculate that the attack occurred precisely at that moment. All three men were charged with murder. Witnesses immediately came forward, pointing to Vilt as the person who attempted to sell a rifle. However, he had a solid alibi as he was at a bank during the time of the attack and could prove it. In 2014, Gustavo Lossi was sentenced for 30 years in prison, while Vera was released due to insufficient evidence and his denial of guilt. He also claimed to have an alibi. However, the prosecutor demanded a review of the case, and in 2016, both men were sentenced to life imprisonment. It seemed that one of the most high-profile cases in Argentine history had reached its conclusion. But no, the story doesn't end there. French journalist Jean-Charles Chattard dedicated 4 years to his own investigation of this case and wrote a book presenting his arguments as to why the girls couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve on July 15, as the investigators claim. The journalist is convinced that the girls didn't die in the reserve, their bodies were simply brought there after the murder. Firstly, even after a short walk in the reserve, his shoes were covered in dust and dirt, unlike the victim's shoes. The girls couldn't have taken such a path, then endured violence, fought for their lives, and still had clean shoes. Secondly, the appearance of the tourists, in general, was strange. Their clothing was more suited for an evening event in the city rather than a hike in the nature reserve. The next strange thing is that the bodies lay in Quebrada de San Lorenzo for 2 weeks. The reserve is a wild, open area inhabited by pumas, foxes, and condors. After such a period, the police could have found completely gnawed bones. However, the bodies were discovered without a single bite mark. Not to mention that they were lying in a popular reserve near a frequently visited viewpoint. Finally, the pathologist who examined the bodies confidently stated that they were killed 3 to a maximum of 5 days before the autopsy. Regarding the date of the murders, the doctor is categorical and indicated in the report that it was July 26, 2011. Remarkably, The judge who led the investigation changed this date to July 15th. Could it be possible that the judge intentionally manipulated the facts to protect someone? Could the judge intentionally tamper with evidence? Was he trying to protect someone? This is exactly what Nestor Piccolo, the commissioner in charge of the investigation, was convinced of, and it may have cost him his life. Commissioner Piccolo died under mysterious circumstances 4 months after the start of the investigation. He was found at the entrance of the commissioner's office with a bullet in his head. His mother stated that it was her son's decision, but she is certain that he was killed, and it was an execution. No traces of gunpowder were found on Nestor's hands, and before his death, he was working on a new version. According to Clemente Vera, he is innocent, and Gustavo Lossi is simply an accomplice of the real criminals, representatives of the upper classes of the province. Nicholas's investigation worried many people who wanted to hide the truth, including the judge. And the influential local families could not allow the light to be shed on the deaths of the French girls. However, this conspiracy of silence was interrupted in April 2014 by an anonymous letter describing the same trail that Commissioner Piccolo was investigating. The letter was sent to the victims' families in France. Chattard received a copy of it and pursued this lead. The anonymous letter was handwritten by a woman who chose not to sign it out of fear of testifying in court. Chattard spent several months, but eventually found a witness. It turned out to be a girl who is often in the company of a small circle of influential individuals in Salta. She knew that on July 15, 2011, the 2 tourists couldn't have been killed in the nature reserve because they were invited to a party organized by the city's wealthy youth. She paints a completely different picture of what happened. At such parties, alcohol flows freely and everything resembles a movie, but it's all happening in real life. According to the girl, Cassandra and Uriah were among the guests and were seen near the pool. As the evening progressed and more drinks were consumed, the men became increasingly interested in the attractive French women. Around 3 a.m., they led them inside the house, and no one saw them after that. The guys started harassing one of the tourists. Of course, she refused, but her opinion no longer mattered to the men, and things went too far. Her friend witnessed what happened, so the guys decided to kill both of them to prevent the truth from being revealed. However, they didn't rush. They tortured the victims for several days before finally killing them. The witness provided the exact location where this supposedly happened, a villa in the most fashionable district of the city, Buena Vista, where deputies, ministers, and wealthy foreigners reside. The villa is usually not occupied permanently as it is often rented out for private parties. There is also a pool, which is where the French women were last seen. But the most intriguing part is the villa's location, right beneath where the bodies were found. Behind the house, there is a hidden path leading to the lookout point of the nature reserve. If everything happened as the witness claims, the bodies of the girls were carried under the cover of night, taken through that path, and left in the dense undergrowth of the reserve. However, how could such a wild scenario, unfolding at a party in plain sight, remain a secret for so long? The witness claims that it can be explained by the terror imposed by the real criminals on anyone who dares to speak up. According to her, the party was organized by the son of a deputy who attacked the French woman. When she tried to escape, he severely beat her. 2 other sons of the politician were also involved in the assault and later in the murder. Today, the deputy's face calmly looks down from numerous billboards during his latest election campaign. By the way, one of his sons followed in his father's footsteps and became a politician as well. The politician refused to comment on these allegations, but one judge who presided over the initial investigation showed a great interest in the story described in the anonymous letter. He believes that it contains everything necessary to achieve justice. However, the judge who took over the case afterward had no intention of seeking other culprits. He believes that the family must be very influential to manipulate the police, and he attributes the deaths of the French women to the provincial justice system. The new version gives more weight to the witness's story, according to which he saw the two French women leaving the nature reserve on July 15. This means that the crime could have occurred in a different place and at a different time than what the investigators insist on. As for the blurred photographs supposedly taken during the attack in the nature reserve, Cassandra's father, Jean-Michel Bouvier, submitted the photo to an expert who believes that it has been manipulated using a photo editing program. The angle of the shot and the lighting cannot be as depicted in the photograph. In France, the victims' families no longer expect anything from the justice system. Jean-Michel Bouvier conducted an independent DNA analysis on his daughter's body. DNA from Gustavo Lossi and 2 other male individuals, as well as 1 female DNA, were found on the most intimate parts. There was no trace of Clemente Vieira's sample. The ownership of the other samples remains unknown, raising questions about the identities of the other individuals involved in the attack on the girls and the true role of Gustavo Lossi. Meanwhile, in the heart of San Lorenzo, a few hundred meters from the place where Cassandra and Uriah's bodies were found, there still stands the modest home of Clemente Vieira's parents. After their son's arrest, they struggle to make ends meet as they are unable to work the land or care for animals in their advanced age. Clemente's parents, his wife, and many local residents believe in his innocence. They believe that his only fault is living close to the crime scene and not having the means to afford lawyers. It is especially sad considering that nothing in the case files connects him to the crime. He claims that the police beat him, that threatened him and his child, demanding a confession to the murder. When he refused to comply, they ransacked his house in search of any incriminating evidence, but they were unsuccessful. In connection with this, in 2017, Santos Clemente Vieira filed a complaint with the Supreme Court of Argentina, and in June 2020, he was granted permission for a case review. He hopes that a new trial will be conducted, during which he will be acquitted. Interestingly, Cassandra's father is convinced of his innocence. He witnessed all the hearings, traveled to Argentina multiple times to learn the details of the case, and conducted his own investigation, concluding that Vieira did not commit the crime. Therefore, he visited Vieira in prison, apologized to him, and then started a social media campaign for his release. Bouvier is concerned that the case review is taking an endlessly long time, while an innocent person continues to sit in prison in Salta. On November 25, 2013, on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, a monument was solemnly unveiled in memory of Cassandra and Uriah. Alfredo Garzon, a sculptor from Salta who lived in Paris, responded to Jean-Michel Bouvier's request to take on this work. By depicting an outstretched hand, eyes, and the face with an anguished expression, Alfredo managed to create a very powerful image conveying the pain, horror, and suffering that the girls went through. The sculpture is located in the San Lorenzo ravine, where the victims' bodies were found. In the morning of August 15, 1989, Wolfgang Silaf received a phone call in his office. Mom has disappeared. He heard through the tears in the voice of Yasmin, the 20-year-old daughter of his younger sister Birgit Meyer, who was 41 at the time. Wolfgang immediately understood that his sister couldn't have simply vanished and abandoned her daughter. Despite the fact that the girl was no longer a child, they had maintained a very close and trusting relationship with her mother. In 1989, Wolfgang was leading the criminal police department in Hamburg, however. Even such an influential person couldn't secure a thorough investigation into his sister's disappearance by the police in the city of Lüneburg, where Birgit lived. Firstly, the Lüneburg police were occupied with the investigation of 2 murders, to which they devoted all their resources. Secondly, apart from their workload, there was another reason to approach this case somewhat carelessly. They had a suspect from the very beginning, Birgit's husband Harold Meyer. The man was a successful businessman working in the printing industry. He had started dating another woman after separating from his wife a few months before Birgit's disappearance. Birgit, who was unemployed at the time of their separation, struggled with the impending divorce and occasionally sought solace in alcohol. However, on the evening of August 14, 1989, Birgit greeted her husband with a smile. Harold came to discuss the terms of their separation, and it seemed that the woman had finally come to terms with her emotions. Birgit and Harold had a friendly discussion about the conditions of their divorce. Birgit was supposed to receive 500,000 Deutsche Marks and agreed to move out of the family home near Lüneburg. The next day, they had agreed to go to a notary. However, in the morning, Yasmin discovered her mother's disappearance. Birgit's Opel Cabriolet was parked in the garage, but there was no sign of the woman anywhere in the house. As it would later become known, her documents had also disappeared. Apart from a shoe print near Birgit's house, there were no slightest indications of a committed crime, no blood, no signs of struggle. According to Birgit's husband, the previous evening had gone smoothly, and they hadn't argued. After her husband left, Birgit had spoken on the phone with her mother and daughter and had mentioned that she and her husband didn't quarrel and that the meeting went well. However, despite Harold's statements, the police suspected that the husband had found another way to part with his wife and avoid paying her 500,000. Today, Harold Meyer continues to live in the same house from which his wife disappeared without a trace. He remembers Birgit as always being his loyal friend whom he could fully rely on. However, many believe Harold was guilty of his wife's disappearance and later her murder. He heard constant whispers and rumors. His friends questioned whether he had taken Birgit in his Porsche and dumped her into the sea from his motorboat. Even his own daughter sometimes had a silent question in her eyes, wondering if he knew something about her mother's whereabouts, and if the police could be right in their suspicions. Only Wolfgang Zilaf believed that Harold had nothing to do with his sister's disappearance because Harold and Birgit never argued about money. When Birgit met Harold, leaving 32 years ago, elegantly dressed, he immediately noticed that she had had a few drinks to lift her spirits. He teased her, saying that she probably didn't plan on getting bored, and she flirtatiously replied, "Who knows?" Now he believes that her killer was nearby at that moment, already waiting for the opportune moment to attack her. However, it was only 6 weeks after Birgit's disappearance that Harold began to have suspicions about what might have happened that day. A colleague of his wife told him that on the day of Birgit's disappearance, she had cheerfully mentioned the neighbor's gardener in a conversation. Allegedly, he had knocked on Birgit's door, introduced himself, and asked for directions to a certain house, even though he already knew the address. Harold didn't know what to think. He remembered a party in the neighboring house where the gardener was also present. A quiet and silent man, blonde with very beautiful features but a terrifying gaze. Harold recalled how he had been extremely frightened by the cold and evaluative look in his icy eyes. And now it turned out that Birgit had met him a few months before her disappearance, right after that party at the neighbor's. She had been drinking excessively, and the gardener had escorted her home. Harold reported this new acquaintance of his wife to the police. The investigators found out that the gardener, who also worked at the cemetery, was named Kurt Werner Wichmann. He was handsome but an extremely dangerous type. In his early years, he had threatened a young mother and her child with a knife, and in his youth, he abducted a hitchhiking girl, subjected her to abuse, and nearly killed her. After that incident, he spent 5.5 years in prison. Kurt Werner Wichmann, the investigators decided to personally talk to Wichmann and invited him to the police station. He showed up wearing gloves, claiming it was due to allergies. Wichmann stated that he had an alibi during the time of the woman's disappearance. After work, he spent the entire evening at home and only went for a walk with his German Shepherd after 10 p.m., but it didn't take him more than 15 minutes. His words were confirmed by his wife. Wisely, Wichmann decided not to mention that he had been on sick leave on the day of Birgit's disappearance and didn't need to go to work. It wouldn't have been difficult for the police to verify this, but surprisingly, Wichmann didn't seem worthy of attention as a suspect to any of the investigators. Wolfgang noted that at the very least, a preliminary investigation should have been initiated. However, this did not happen. The brother of the missing woman constantly heard from his colleagues that they were doing everything possible but unfortunately couldn't find her. When he tried to gather more information about the case, they fell silent. Days, months, and years passed before a new prosecutor in Lüneburg took up the case. It was only in 1993, 3.5 years after Birgit's disappearance, that a criminal case was filed against Kurt Werner Wichmann on suspicion of Birgit Meyer's murder. On a cold February morning in 1993, the police knocked on the door of a brick house on the outskirts of Lüneburg, Kurt Werner Wichmann's home. His wife opened the door, but her husband was not at home. The police presented a search warrant and began their work. The search immediately led the officers to a recently demolished wall made of plasterboard in the basement. On the first floor, they noticed a soundproof door. Kurt's wife explained that she didn't have a key. It was only in possession of her husband and his brother. The officers forced open the door, behind which awaited a veritable arsenal, 2 small-caliber rifles, a revolver, silencers, ammunition, stun guns, knives, sedatives, chains, ropes, and handcuffs with traces of blood. The police confiscated all these items. During the search of the surrounding area, a metal detector was triggered. With the help of a police excavator, they managed to dig up something extraordinary in Wichmann's garden: an entire car, a brand new bright red Ford sports coupe, on the back seat of which forensic experts found blood. The search team also detected a strong smell of decomposing flesh inside the car, but no actual body was found. Shortly thereafter, the police found a parked VW Golf near Lüneburg registered to Wichmann. Inside the car, they discovered road maps, a sleeping bag, a thermos, and binoculars. The equipment seemed more suitable for a hunter or someone who spends a lot of time spying on people they intend to kill. For several weeks, Kurt managed to evade the authorities. However, on April 15, 1993, an accident occurred on a country road near Heilbronn. The police inspected the car, which contained 2 men. Weapons were found in the car, so the driver was taken to the station. It was discovered that the driver was Kurt, and his younger brother was sitting next to him in the car. The police did not believe that Kurt could pose a danger to himself, so they did not confiscate his belt. The man died in his prison cell on April 25, 1993, at the age of 43. The police quickly closed the case because, according to the German Code of Criminal Procedure, the deceased should not become the subject of an investigation. However, this was far from the end of the story. Rather, it was the beginning of an investigation that would lead to the uncovering of the most horrifying crimes in the country's criminal history. In 2002, Wolfgang retired and was able to dedicate more attention and time to his sister's case. He gained access to the case files and was shocked. To his horror, he discovered that all the evidence had been destroyed, including the red Ford that was unearthed, and the basement in Kurt's house, where the search team had sensed the presence of remains, had never been thoroughly investigated. However, in Wolfgang's opinion, the evidence should have been preserved. Firstly, because there is no statute of limitations on murder cases. Secondly, the principle of not conducting an investigation against the dead is not applicable in this case because there is another suspect, Birgit Harold, the husband of Birgit Meyer. To justify or condemn Harold, all the evidence needed to be examined. The neighbors of Kurt needed to be interrogated. In short, regular police work needed to be done. But now, it was impossible to study the evidence. Nevertheless, Wolfgang decided not to give up and assembled a group of volunteers from his former colleagues. They discussed the motives, possible developments, and the behavior of the perpetrator again and again. Finally, they came up with the idea that Birgit's disappearance might be connected to other unsolved crimes. In search of confirmation of this theory, Wolfgang went to Wymann's house. The secret room had hardly changed since it was discovered in 1993. In the room, he found video recordings of 2 TV shows, one about Birgit Meyer's disappearance and the other about the murders in Gode. Wolfgang immediately informed the police in Lüneburg, and nothing happened. The cases remained unsolved for years. In 2015, the head of the criminal police department in Lüneburg was replaced. Wolfgang managed to convince him to create a commission to review his sister's case. The commission was led by an experienced and meticulous specialist, Richard Kaufmann, who had solved all his cases over the past few years. He discovered that a tiny drop of blood was found on the handcuffs found in Wyman's secret room, and the sample had not been destroyed because it was stored at the Hanover Medical School laboratory. DNA comparison showed that the blood belonged to Birgit Meyer. Now, there was no doubt that Wyman had handcuffed Birgit and probably killed her. The investigator speculated that he wanted to kidnap her and demand a ransom from Harold, but something went wrong. It was evident that at least 2 people were involved in the abduction because a neighbor heard the sound of a running car engine that night. Where could Birgit's body have been? The investigator examined several graves dug in the cemetery when Wyman worked there, but Birgit Meyer was not found in them. Then Wolfgang decided to find out everything he could about the man's past. First of all, one should not imagine a spoiled boy from a wonderful family. His father used to threaten his mother with an axe and was cruel to his sons. Young Kurt Werner Wyman ended up in a social institution called Witch and Stiff, and after the New Year holidays in 1964, he didn't want to go back. But he needed money to escape, so the 14-year-old boy entered the apartment of his parents' tenants, a young family, with a dagger and a flashlight. The husband was at work, and only the mother and the infant were at home. The woman woke up because of the flashlight's light, screamed, and the boy lightly choked her to prevent her from screaming. Then he turned to the child, and the woman was about to believe that he would do something to her son, but fortunately, he changed his mind. Unfortunately, the girl whom 22-year-old Kurt decided to give a ride to in 1970 was not so lucky. Offering a hitchhiking girl to get in his car, he took her to the forest and attacked her. After getting what he wanted, he choked the poor girl a little and threw her in the trunk, apparently planning to bury her. However, something incredible happened. When he opened the trunk again, the girl, who had regained consciousness, managed to convince the man to let her go, pretending that he shouldn't be afraid of her. But when he read an article about the attack in the newspaper 2 days later, he realized that the events described in it were not as he perceived them. And what did he do?
He went to the police to, as he claimed, correct some facts. After adjusting the facts, the man spent 5.5 years in prison. People who knew Kirk describe him as an arrogant loner. He didn't need friends, but he had a strong need for recognition, so he was a braggart from childhood and loved things, especially cars, that he couldn't afford. Realizing what kind of person Kurt was, Wolfgang understood that he was obsessed with control. He was a narcissist for whom it was important how he appeared in the eyes of others. The desire to control his external image was so great that he was even willing to turn himself in after committing a crime. Therefore, Wolfgang assumed that his sister Birgit Meyer's body was hidden in Wyman's house or on the premises of his house. It's sad that when he asked the police in Lüneburg to conduct a thorough search there a few years ago, they didn't listen to him. As the head of the investigation group told him, his criminal experience told him that Birgit wasn't there. While he was saying this, he was standing right above her body, with only a concrete slab separating them. When Wolfgang finally opened the concrete floor in Kurt's garage many years later, he found what was left of his sister's body. The autopsy showed that Birgit Meyer was shot in the head, just like at least one of the victims of the Hort murders and another victim of the 1968 murder. The Birgit case was solved, but Wolfgang decided not to stop there, remembering other families waiting for the crimes that affected their loved ones to be solved. Thus, thanks to Wolfgang's persistence, a crime that had terrified the entire northern part of Germany in the 90s was finally solved at the end of 2017. The murders in Gord. Gord is the vast wooded area east of Lüneburg. In July 1989, the weather in northern Germany was sunny and hot, prompting many people to seek refuge from the summer heat in the cool shade of the forest. On July 12, 1989, 2 days before Birgit's disappearance,
3 people who were picking blueberries in gourd suddenly smelled a nauseating sweet odor. Trying to find the source of the smell, they discovered a human hand under a pine tree among the branches. It turned out that on May 21, 1989, a married couple from Hamburg, 51-year-old Peter and 45-year-old Ursula Reinhold, went on a picnic in the forest, intending to spend a pleasant time in the fresh air. They were brutally murdered, and their bodies were dragged away from the scene of the attack. When they were discovered, the husband and wife were almost naked, but it was unclear whether the perpetrator had undressed them or if they had undressed themselves before the attack. The killer took their picnic basket, binoculars, and the keys to their car, which he used to escape. The car was later found in another city. The disappearance of the couple was reported, but they could not be found for 7 weeks. Due to the heat, very little remained of their bodies, making it impossible to determine the cause of death. However, robbery was ruled out as the motive because valuable items were still found on the victims. Since there were no mobile phones at the time, the people picking berries hurried to the forest ranger to inform him of the horrifying discovery so that he could report it to the police. However, it was not just the bodies themselves that terrified the Germans, who nicknamed Gourd the Dead Forest. The unique fact in modern criminal history in Germany was that while the police were still examining Peter and Ursula's bodies, the killer claimed the lives of another couple located just 800 meters away from the investigators. On July 12, 1989, Ingrid Warmbier, 46, and Bernd Michael Kopping, 43, from Hanover, arrived in Gourd. They were spouses but not with each other, which is why they chose this forest. After parking their car, they walked about 2 kilometers into the forest. They were brutally killed, sound of a gunshot, and then the killer took their Polaroid camera and the keys to their car, with which he fled. It was later determined that he drove the car for about a week before abandoning it. The bodies were discovered by chance only 2 weeks later when the police were searching the area due to the first 2 murders. The crime scenes were only 800 meters apart, but subsequent tests showed that the police working on the first murder could not hear the gunshots due to the locations of the crime scenes in the depressions. Given the new discovery, the random encounter of the berry pickers became of great importance. As they hurried to the forest ranger to report the horrifying find, they encountered a man. Of course, 2 weeks later, their description of the person would be quite vague. But they remembered that they had encountered a tall and strong 40-year-old brunette with medium-length hair, without glasses or a beard. He was carrying a bag that was clearly not empty. Based on the witnesses' accounts, a composite sketch was created even if this man might not have had any connection to the crime. The common factor in these murders was that they were committed in the same area of a vast forest. Additionally, the victims were both of middle age. In 2 cases, the perpetrator stole the victim's belongings, although it was not a typical robbery. He would leave the crime scenes in the victims' cars and then abandon the vehicles in small towns with railway connections. Both towns were located along the Hanover-Hamburg route, and these parallels led investigators to speculate that the same person was responsible for the crimes. In 1989, Kurt Werner Weimann was 40 years old and lived 30 kilometers away from Gourd. On the day of the secret lover's murder, he was on sick leave. The spouses were also killed on a Sunday when Kurt didn't have to go to work. However, the investigators initially found no evidence linking Weimann to the crimes in Gourd. Furthermore, he did not resemble the composite sketch. Therefore, the police focused on other suspects, suspecting that the deceived husband of the second victim had hired a professional to deal with his unfaithful wife and her lover but accidentally targeted the wrong person before carrying out the hit. Once again, Wolfgang couldn't understand the investigators' decision. He and his group of colleagues immediately suspected that Kurt matched the profile of the Gourd killer. The brutality of the crimes and the intimate aspects, as evidenced by the victim's exposed clothing, all aligned with Weimann's profile. Moreover, years ago, Wolfgang found a videotape of the TV program Aktenzeichen Sei, which covered the Gourd murders, in Kurt's secret room. Being a narcissist, Kurt also collected video recordings and newspaper clippings about Berdid Maya. There were also pieces of evidence showing that the man sought information about Bernd Michael Kopping, who was killed in Gord. However, as often happens today, the DNA analysis provided the final piece of evidence. The Gord killer had a habit of driving the victims' cars for several days. In one of the vehicles, 3 hairs and possibly other biological materials were found. However, it took nearly 30 years before the DNA in the car was compared to Kurt's DNA. Only at the end of 2017 did the analysis yield a match. Kurt Werner Weimann was the perpetrator of the 2 murders in Gord. It all started right where it ended, at St. Malachy's Church in Tyrone, Northern Ireland. In December 2010, beauty queen and teacher Michaela Hart and sports star John McCrime tied the knot, sharing their celebration with over 300 guests. However, just 3 weeks later, John returned with the body of his young wife, who was buried in her pristine wedding gown. What led to Michaela's death? Who could be so heartless and calculated as to take the life of a woman who had just begun to enjoy married life with her beloved? And will the collaborative efforts of multiple countries help uncover one of the most memorable and harrowing crimes of recent years? The captain of the Irish football team, John McCrime, and the daughter of one of the country's top football managers, Michaela Hart, met at university in 2005. It was love at first sight, and since then, the young couple had never been apart. During a vacation in Paris, John proposed to Michaela, and she happily accepted. They planned their wedding for New Year's Eve, on Michaela's 27th birthday. After the ceremonial wedding, the newlyweds boarded a plane, embarking on their 3-week honeymoon. They spent the first week in Dubai before the most anticipated part of their trip began, 2 weeks at the 5-star Legends Hotel, located in the fishing village of Grand Gauba on the northeast coast of Mauritius. Michaela chose Mauritius as their paradise island for the dreamy honeymoon and carefully researched local hotels. They settled on Legends Hotel due to its numerous positive reviews and popularity among tourists from Ireland. Upon arrival at the hotel, they asked the receptionist if they could be allocated one of their best rooms. They were informed that there was a vacant room in the luxury block, room 1025. January 10, 2011, after having breakfast together, John decided to play golf while Michaela sunbathed. They met again for lunch. Michaela always enjoyed having tea with something delicious after lunch. She asked her husband to order tea while she went to the room to get Kit Kat bars with her favorite dark chocolate, which she had brought from Dubai and kept in the refrigerator. John offered to bring the treats for her, but it was only 150 steps from the restaurant to the room, so she went by herself. John took some photos and watched videos while waiting for his wife to return. After some time, he began to wonder why Michaela hadn't come back yet. He decided to look for her. Knocking on the door, John received no response. Since he had forgotten his key in the room, he peeked through the window but couldn't see anything, so he went to the receptionist. The corridor attendant led him back to the room and opened the door with his key. However, as soon as the corridor attendant took a few steps away from the door, he heard the cries of a man asking for immediate help. Upon entering the room, John discovered his wife in the bathtub filled with cold water. Bruises were visible on her neck, her skin was icy to the touch, and her lips had turned blue. Assuming that Michaela had intended to take a bath due to back pain but slipped or lost consciousness, John attempted to help her. However, his efforts were in vain. Within an hour, medical professionals pronounced Michaela's death, bringing an end to the dreams of a young and happy married couple. Presumably, due to the initial assumption of an unfortunate accident, nobody attempted to secure the crime scene, and people constantly entered and exited the newlyweds' room. The police were initially informed that a tourist had drowned, but upon entering the room and observing the state of Michaela's body and the disorder in the room, they suspected a murder had taken place. The distraught husband was taken to the police station and held for questioning for 5 hours. This was not unusual since most murders are committed by individuals close to the victims. What was abnormal in John's case was the cruelty and inappropriateness of the statements made by the police officers. Naturally, John couldn't hide his tears over the loss of Michaela. Just half an hour earlier, he had seen his wife happily walking towards their room, but now he discovered her lifeless body in the bathtub. However, upon seeing his tears, a police officer, perhaps trying to console him, said, "Why are you crying? You're still young. You'll find yourself a new wife." It is unknown how long they would have kept John at the station if it hadn't been for the hotel manager's intervention. The manager informed the police that the door of room 1025 had been opened with a stolen master key that fit all the locks. It became evident that the murder had been committed by someone from the hotel staff. It was likely an unintentional murder. Someone among the staff, possibly a security guard with access to the master key, entered the room at 2:42 p.m. 2 minutes later, Michaela opened her own door. The thief, possibly hiding in a small niche in the bathroom, had to quickly consider his options due to the unexpected presence of the maid. If his duties involved room cleaning, he could have simply smiled at Michaela, pretended to do his job, and nothing would have happened because it's a common situation in a hotel. However, if he was a security guard, he knew that his presence in the room would not be easily explainable. So, the only option he saw for himself was to hide in the bathroom and hope that the woman would simply leave. But that didn't happen. As investigators speculated, Michaela decided to take advantage of the opportunity and entered the bathroom. Inside, she encountered the thief. Michaela got scared and ran, and the thief, in panic, attacked her. Realizing that he had killed Michaela, he placed her in the bathtub. Perhaps he tried to create the appearance of an accidental incident with the maid. Despite the shock, he may have also thought that water would wash away any DNA evidence left on his victim. When John got up from the table at 3:05 p.m. and went to check why his wife was taking so long, the killer was still in the room. If John had his keycard with him, he could have caught the killer at the scene of the crime. However, by the time he went to the administrator, asked for the door to be opened, and entered the room, it was already 3:26 p.m., and the thief, unintentionally turned murderer, had vanished. Releasing John put the police under immense pressure. When a tourist is killed in a country that heavily relies on tourism, it becomes crucial to quickly solve the case. It seemed like the case would be solved promptly because the local police chief stated that the island had a 100% homicide clearance rate. One might think he was just acknowledging the efforts of his subordinates, but any professional would be suspicious considering that in 2011, besides Michaela, 30 other people were killed on the island, and all cases, except Michaela's, were solved based on confessions from suspects. The following year, the police once again solved all cases based on confessions. The fact that the police excessively relied on instinct and intuition, if it can be called that, could have been compensated by the fact that the investigators had an ideal crime scene. The hotel room was cleaned every day. Each entry into the room was recorded by the security system. Surveillance cameras were placed everywhere, and the hotel itself was practically an impregnable fortress, with vigilant security guards everywhere. As it will become clear shortly, that was not the case at all. Within 2 days of the murder, the police arrested several hotel employees, and 2 of them, Avinash Tribhuwan and Sandit Mania, were charged with the murder while the others reluctantly became key prosecution witnesses. A week later, a hotel security guard named Dasan Narayanan was also arrested. Dasan was on duty on the day of the murder. His exact location at the time of the crime could not be confirmed, but his fingerprints were found on a fake key that the thieves used to replace the stolen universal key in the security room. Dasan couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for how his DNA ended up on the safe door in the room. He admitted to touching Michaela's cheek when he rushed to help John, offering an explanation in advance for how his DNA could be present if it was found. However, despite Dasan's conflicting statements, the police decided to charge him only with being an accomplice to the thefts, focusing their main efforts on Avinash and Sandeep. On May 22, 2012, the trial began. The prosecution built its case primarily on the confession obtained by the police, following their customary practice. Prosecutors argued that when Michaela returned to the room on that day, she caught Avinash and Sandeep stealing money from the safe or her purse. Since hotel employees are often the main breadwinners for their families, not just immediate relatives, the thieves preferred to silence Michaela to avoid losing their jobs. During the trial, their colleague Raj Thikoi also testified. He was initially arrested but became the key prosecution witness and received immunity. Raj stated that he was near the room and heard the agonized cries of a woman but didn't knock on the door. Instead, he hid and saw the agitated and sweaty Avinash and Sandeep leave the newlyweds' room. Later, he asked what had happened, and they replied, "Nothing happened, just keep quiet. If you say anything, we'll involve you in this matter." In addition to witness testimonies, the prosecutors largely relied on the confession obtained from one of the suspects, Avinash Tripuwoon, following the customary police practices. Despite the fact that Sandeep and Avinash were the accused, it created an impression that the police themselves were being judged alongside them as they conducted a careless investigation. The defense attorneys drew attention to all the evident gaps, inaccuracies, and blatant errors made by the investigators. Firstly, after the discovery of Michaela's body, the hotel was not sealed off, and not a single guest or staff member was interviewed. Some tests were not conducted, while others were only performed after the hotel room was returned to the hotel's control, compromising the evidence. Fingerprints and palm prints were found in the room, but their owners were not identified. However, no DNA evidence indicating the guilt of Sandeep and Avinash was found. Even the paper currency, which according to the prosecutors interested the thieves, was not fingerprinted or examined for DNA. The court also heard that all the crime scene photographs were taken in black and white, and many important items were not photographed at all. But the biggest uproar was caused by the mystery of the 46 surveillance cameras capturing the events inside and around the hotel. Despite numerous requests, the police did not hand over the video recordings to the defense attorneys. It turned out that they did not withhold the footage because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. 90% of the videos were erased by the police officers who were unable to operate the cameras. When asked to demonstrate how the equipment works, instead of honestly answering yes, they simply pressed the button. It happened to be the record button, and when they thought they were playing back the recordings, they were actually erasing them. The glaring incompetence of the police made international media wonder if the local authorities were deliberately sabotaging the investigation. Finally, the accused claimed that they only made confessions after being subjected to torture by the police. Dasan Narayanan, who allegedly gave Sandeep the key card, claimed that he was forced to make the confession under threat of a weapon. Avinash also denied his statements, stating that the police tortured him and interrogated him with water, after which he vomited blood. Furthermore, he was allegedly told that his wife would be deported and he would be forced to live in Ireland with John McCrime, who would now need a new spouse. Avinash stated that he didn't even read his own confession because he simply signed the document that was presented to him. Another witness stated that he was forced to give false testimony, even though he and Sandeep were actually in room 1009 at the time of the murder, where a VIP client was supposed to stay, and Sandeep insisted on his subordinate maintaining perfect cleanliness in the room. At one point, he even grabbed the mop himself and demonstrated how the floors should be cleaned. Additionally, Sandeep claimed that he was on the phone with his sister in Britain at the time of the crime, which was corroborated by telecommunications data. Finally, the preserved surveillance camera footage also confirmed that he was in a different part of the hotel at the time of the murder. Overall, the court proceedings, which were expected to last for 2 weeks, dragged on for almost 8 weeks. This was largely due to the defense attorneys crossing the boundaries of decorum and turning the trial into a show. They constantly made jokes and elicited bursts of laughter among the bored onlookers and law students present in the courtroom. The defense raised the issue of there potentially being a sexual motive for the crime, hinting at the involvement of Michaela's husband. They referred to an intimate aid they found in the hotel room and insinuated possible misconduct between John and his wife. However, it turned out to be a simple insert from a women's magazine, Cosmopolitan, which Michaela had purchased at the airport. They then attempted to prove that John and Michaela had a severe argument, presenting a video that allegedly confirmed this. However, the individuals in the video were not Michaela and John, but rather two people resembling them from Germany. As a result, John had to contact this man on Facebook and request him to provide a statement at a police station in Germany, confirming that he was the one in the video. Overall, Michaela's family was incredibly distressed by the sensationalism surrounding the case of her murder. In particular, a local newspaper conducted a survey titled "Who Killed Michaela?" and John ended up ranking high on the list of the readers' votes. Additionally, the Mauritian newspaper published by the police the photos of Michaela's naked and bruised body, causing indescribable anguish to her family. Nevertheless, these 8 weeks came to an end, and it was time for the jury members to make their decision. The judge summarized the case, clearly pointing out the guilt of the suspects, leading Michaela's family to believe that it would give the accused the right to demand a review of the case after a guilty verdict. They had no doubt that the verdict would be exactly as they anticipated. Furthermore, the judge strongly advised the jury not to consider the impact this case would have on the country's image, but to make the right decision from their perspective. And after 2 months of trial, deliberating for only 2 hours, the jury declared Avinash and Sandeep innocent. After the acquittal verdict, John and Michaela's families were incredibly disappointed. They endured all the agony of the process, inappropriate remarks from attorneys and police, tolerated laughter in the courtroom, and even faced aggressive behavior from the locals because they were confident that the guilty parties would be punished for the murder. They were certain of Avinash and Sandeep's guilt and believed that they were acquitted because the case received global media attention, and the jurors did not want the murder case to reflect negatively on Mauritius' image. The Hart and McCavery families cannot forget that Avinash's lawyer appeared on a local radio station and essentially admitted his client's guilt, mentioning how Avinash cried and apologized to Michaela's family. The interview was supposed to be presented in court, but the lawyer managed to evade his responsibilities. John believes that Avinash told the truth when he confessed to Michaela's murder, and here's why. When anyone hears about death by strangulation, they imagine the killer choking the victim, gripping their neck with 2 hands. But Avinash recounted that when they were in the honeymoon suite, Michaela walked in and saw him holding a wallet. She asked what he was doing. She couldn't have known that Sandeep was in the bathroom. When the girl tried to prevent Avinash from leaving the room, standing in his way, Sandeep approached her from behind and wrapped one hand around her neck. The thing is, the autopsy report was compiled much later, and it confirmed that everything happened exactly as Avinash described. How could Avinash have invented such a method of strangulation if he didn't know it for sure? Additionally, Avinash mentioned that Michaela hit her head on the floor when she fell. The bruise on the back of her head, found during the autopsy, confirmed that as well. Furthermore, in summarizing the case, the judge reminded everyone that Avinash made his confession on January 12th and signed it on the 13th in the presence of his lawyer. If the police wanted to fabricate the confession, they would have forced Avinash to sign something else on the 12th. Moreover, the boy was examined by 3 doctors on different days, and none of them found any signs of torture on him. After the acquittal verdict, a new investigation was initiated. The police focused on a crucial piece of evidence, the keycard that the thief and murderer used to enter the room. However, even the mechanism of these locks cannot be trusted. The locks are not synchronized, and each of the 240 locks in the Legends Hotel shows its own time on the security systems panel, making it impossible to determine the exact time when the killer entered Michaela's room. As a result, The alibi of practically any suspect is in question because the exact time of the crime is unknown. To make matters worse, another significant loophole was found in the hotel's guest security. This loophole could increase the number of potential suspects from dozens to hundreds. If the hotel owns the guest rooms, restaurants, bars, golf courses, and similar areas, the beach is considered public property. According to Mauritian law, the island's beaches belong to the local residents, and fishermen and traders have always had full access to both the beach and the hotel's premises. Local traders sell their crafts to tourists, and young boys are accustomed to spending time on the hotel's grounds. In other words, despite the cameras, gates, and security personnel, the hotel is unable to provide complete protection of its premises, and there is no way to verify who had access to the Honeymoon suite. As a result, the new investigation into the case also ended up with no significant breakthroughs. Under international pressure, the Mauritian police revisited Michaela's murder multiple times and even enlisted the services of a French laboratory for retesting DNA samples. In 2014, there was information about a breakthrough in the case when DNA found on Michaela's clothing matched the DNA of one of the suspects. However, this discovery was insufficient to warrant a new trial. In 2017, in an attempt to draw attention back to the case, John announced a substantial reward for information about the case. A few weeks after his return home, he received a call from a lawyer informing him that the arrests of Sandeep and Avinash were now inevitable. The lawyer did not specify the new evidence that made this possible, but Michaela's family felt relieved and believed that they would finally achieve justice. However, weeks and months passed, and no one was arrested. The case was officially closed in 2020, but in 2021, under pressure from Irish politicians, the Mauritian government agreed to reopen the case. The problem lies in the fact that the willingness to re-examine the case does not guarantee that it will be solved. Investigating any murder after 10 years is challenging, let alone considering the possibility that officials in Mauritius may lack the desire to find the killers. Over the course of 10 years, many investigators have climbed the career ladder, and if something is revealed in the case that many would prefer to bury, heads will roll. After the trial, John and Michaela's family filed a lawsuit against the hotel for €1.6 million. They settled the case out of court, and the details of the agreement are not disclosed, but the money went to a foundation established in Michaela's honor. Legends Hotel was renamed Lux Hotel and continues to enjoy immense popularity, as does Room 1025, which underwent renovations and was assigned the new number 1026. John, who now works as an accountant, met a pleasant girl named Cara Breanna at a memorial dinner for Michaela in 2013. Tara, also an accountant, received a marriage proposal from John in 2015. Last year, the couple welcomed their first child, James McCavery. November 4th, 1989. A quiet night in the fashionable district of Daytona Beach, Florida. Only the lights on the porch illuminate the extravagant mansions, whose occupants have long gone to sleep. Suddenly, the silence of the night was shattered by police sirens after a desperate call was received at the rescue service at 4:54 from the Fotopoulos family's house. In the bedroom on the second floor, officers found a man holding his wounded wife to his chest. Another man lay motionless in a pool of blood on the floor. Members of the small but influential Greek community in the city, Costa and Lisa Fotopoulos, along with Lisa's mother and brother, lived in a huge white mansion on the banks of the Halifax River. The officers were met by Lisa's brother, who led them to the bedroom on the second floor. 26-year-old Lisa Fotopoulos was alive but in agony. She had been shot, and the bullet had entered her head, although hope was not yet lost as it had not penetrated her brain. It struck her forehead, deflected off a bone, and came to a rest just above her left eye. While it was still a gunshot wound, and the medics couldn't know the extent of the damage until she was examined at the hospital, they believed she had a chance to survive. They rushed her to the hospital as quickly as possible. As for the young man lying on the floor, there was nothing that could be done for him. Costa had shot the intruder who attacked his wife, emptying the entire magazine into him. While Lisa was being rushed to the hospital and newspapers competed to write about the hero who shot the robber, saving his wife and family, the police began investigating the botched robbery. However, it didn't take long for suspicions to arise among the investigators. On the first floor of the house, they found a broken window, indicating the intruder had entered through it. But the window was too small for a sturdy man to fit through without cutting himself. It was also too far from the door handle to open it in such a manner. Furthermore, despite the presence of crystal, silverware, electronics, and artwork in the house, the stranger hadn't touched anything and went straight to the bedroom where he shot Lisa. This raises the question of why her instead of first eliminating the main threat, the husband. Even before morning arrived, the investigators decided to take a closer look at this case and at Lisa's husband. Konstantinos or Kostafotopoulos grew up in Athens, Greece, in a wonderful family. His father held a prominent position as one of the directors of the Greek airline. Since childhood, Costa dreamed of moving to the United States, where he believed a better life awaited him, a life filled with sports cars, big houses, and beautiful women. At the age of 18, he enrolled in Daytona University, where he studied aviation management. To cover his expenses, he worked as a waiter in a restaurant. It was there that he was introduced to Lisa. Even in the modern world, traditional values still hold importance, and every Greek family in the USA wants to marry their child to someone from Greece, a person with the same faith and cultural heritage. Costa seemed to be the ambitious and intelligent Greek guy that parents wanted to see as Lisa's husband. The young woman was captivated by the charm of this young man. He too was impressed, but not by her beauty or intelligence, but by the state of her family. Within a few months, the couple became engaged, followed by a joyous Greek wedding. Costa and Lisa appeared to be an ideal couple. After a few years, Lisa's father passed away, leaving her and her brother in charge of the family business, a theme park and several souvenir shops. Costa worked for her mother, and her brother for $300 a week. It was a decent amount for those times, but not a fortune. Soon, Costa decided to start his own business, something he could fully control. The man took money from his wife and opened a billiard club. For a long time, Lisa had no idea how things were going at the bar and that her husband preferred to hire young kids who, for various reasons, ended up on the streets. Costa surrounded himself with teenagers who were unable to say no to him. He enjoyed portraying himself as a powerful, successful man and would tell the young people that he worked for the CIA, carrying out various government missions. And if any of the kids had doubts about the truthfulness of Costa's words, he had evidence. Framed and hanging on the office wall was a letter from the CIA addressed to Costa. However, if someone bothered to read the letter, they would discover that it was simply a job rejection. Fortunately for Costa, the teenagers believed him unquestioningly, and for them, it was 100% proof that their boss was a secret agent. Things reached a point where Costa invited his business partner, Tony Calderoni, on one of his nocturnal outings. Tony, who didn't believe his friend's tall tales, decided to join him out of curiosity. As a result, he watched with suspicion as Costa, dressed head to toe in camouflage, buried a bag with weapons and money in the woods. The bar trapped Costa in a debt hole. He already owed $20,000, but still continued to enjoy life, playing the role of a super agent. Then, on a beautiful day in 1989, his life became even better after meeting the luxurious 20-year-old Deidre Hunt, who entered his establishment in search of work. Costa was captivated by the beauty of the girl, and soon a romance ensued between them. They didn't care about the 10-year age difference or the fact that Costa was married. Deidre turned out to be the complete opposite of Lisa. Lisa was a true lady, while Deidre was a forbidden fruit, full of passion and desire, something that Costa wasn't getting at home. In turn, he became a source of admiration and expensive gifts for her, providing everything she was lacking in life. Deidre grew up in poverty. She didn't know her father, and her mother suffered from several mental disorders, including multiple personalities, specifically 11 different personalities. The girl never knew what awaited her at home when she returned from school, whether her mother would beat her or shower her with affection. And she had no choice because it was her mother. When Deidre was 7 years old, a neighbor began to harass her, abusing her when she was 11 and he was 31. Instead of support, she only received indifference from her mother. The woman didn't work, spending all the money on alcohol. The situation was worsened by the fact that Deidre had to wear orthopedic braces on her legs to walk properly, and her classmates, sensing Deidre's vulnerability, bullied the ugly duckling. However, everything changed after a few years. She no longer needed the braces, and the girl transformed into a beauty, dark hair, dark eyes, and an attractive figure. She began to receive a lot of attention from men. For Deidre, who had never heard a kind word at her address, it was a kind of drug. She indulged in it fully. At the age of 18, she got involved with a bad crowd and was arrested for armed robbery. After her release, the girl decided to start afresh, and in September 1989, she set off to Daytona Beach, where she could get lost among many street youths. But Deidre didn't get lost. She had charisma and beauty. She quickly became one of the highlights of the bar, strolling around in a black bikini and captivating the regulars. Deidre's difficult childhood and arrest didn't deter Costa. On the contrary, he saw in her a vulnerable girl whom he could manipulate, just like other teenagers hanging out in the bar. Costa rented an apartment for Deidre 2 blocks away from her work so they could meet at any time. And out of habit, he fed the naive girl stories about his work for the CIA and how he had killed 8 people and so on. Of course, Lisa quickly discovered that her husband was seeing the waitress. She followed him to the rented apartment, confirmed the truth, and demanded that he end the affair. However, he stubbornly denied everything. Then the proud Greek woman threatened to divorce him. Costa couldn't allow that because in the case of a divorce, he would not only be left penniless but also burdened with debts. Interestingly, this conversation took place just a few weeks before an unknown person attempted a nighttime visit to their home. Costa told the police that on the evening of November 4th, he and his wife were watching movies late into the night before going to sleep. The next thing he remembered was waking up to a deafening sound. Opening his eyes, he saw the silhouette of an armed man looming over his wife. Almost instinctively, he grabbed the weapon he kept for self-defense, rolled onto the floor, and emptied the entire magazine at the intruder. Miraculously, the bullet had narrowly missed Lisa's brain, and she not only quickly regained consciousness but also was able to speak. She confirmed her husband's account of them going to bed late and waking up in pain when he was talking on the phone with emergency services. However, Lisa added a few other interesting details. She saw her husband burying a black sports bag in the backyard earlier that evening for some unknown reason. Furthermore, she recounted an incident that had occurred at her workplace just a week ago when someone had tried to rob her. A young man held a weapon to her and attempted to force her into a small office space. She managed to fall to the floor and crawl between his legs, escaping from him. Fortunately, he didn't pursue her. As detectives listened to her account, they couldn't shake the thought that it might have been an attempt on Lisa Fotopoulos' life, incident number 1. So, who was the unfortunate intruder who broke into their home? It turned out to be an 18-year-old named Brian L. Chase. His father stated that his son had been missing for a while, getting involved with a bad crowd that frequented Costa Fotopoulos' bar. As the media buzzed about the incident, the news reached the teenagers who frequented Co-Star's bar. A phone call came into the police, altering the course of the investigation. The call was from a 20-year-old named Newman Taylor. Taylor believed that the police would find it interesting to know that if Brian Chase was the one who died, he had been hired to kill the woman. Taylor was a friend of Deirdre, and a few weeks ago, she offered him $10,000 to kill Lisa. It was a tempting offer, but what stopped him was his knowledge of Costa. Taylor was certain that he wouldn't make it out of the Fotopulos house alive because Costa had an arsenal of weapons stored there. He refused, realizing that his own death could be part of the plan. Now, when he read the news, he immediately understood what had happened. Brian was his friend, and he didn't want Deirdre and Costa to get away with it. He knew Brian wasn't the killer, but he was terribly afraid of Costa. He realized that both he and Brian were in danger. The investigators believed the witness because it aligned with what they observed at the crime scene. The police wanted to talk to Deirdre, and they got lucky. She showed up at the police station herself. She confirmed Taylor's words but claimed that the idea to kill Lisa belonged not to her but to her lover. Lisa had found out about her husband's affair and planned to divorce him. In the event of a divorce, Costa would be left bankrupt. But if Lisa died, he hoped to receive a $700,000 insurance payout. In addition to that, Deirdre revealed that the bar was actually a front for money laundering. Costa had a business partner in Greece who produced counterfeit banknotes. That's why he hired street teenagers who didn't ask too many questions. The FBI had suspicions about this, but they didn't have evidence yet. Deirdre admitted that besides Taylor, she approached at least 3 other teenagers with an offer to kill Lisa. The initial plan was to attack Lisa at a Halloween party. However, her friend Taja James, who agreed to carry out the task, got scared of the crowd surrounding the victim. The next incident was the one Lisa reported to the police. After Taja's failures, Deirdre persuaded Brian to commit the crime, promising him $5,000. He was supposed to stage a car accident and then shoot her in the head. But Brian's car simply wouldn't start. The next time he tried to break into the house, he was scared off by the neighbors. Only on the 3rd attempt did he manage to get close to Lisa. Costa disabled the alarm, so the young man entered the house unimpeded, walked straight into the bedroom, and shot the sleeping young woman. He was supposed to shoot again, but the gun jammed, and while he was struggling with it, Costa emptied his entire magazine into him. Costa had initially planned to kill Brian to appear as a hero. But when he realized his wife was alive, he and Deirdre started brainstorming how to finish the job. They decided to dress Deirdre as a nurse and deliver a bomb disguised as flowers to Lisa's ward. Fortunately, the police were guarding Lisa's room, and this plan also failed. Deirdre's story seemed so incredible that the investigators could barely believe it. But it didn't end there. In an almost casual tone, sipping on a Diet Cola and taking a drag from her cigarette, Deirdre claimed that she and Costa had killed before. Their victim was a young man, 19-year-old Mark Kevin Ramsey, who worked at Co-Star's bar. The young man knew about the money laundering, but, unlike most teenagers who kept their mouths shut, he believed he deserved a share. He threatened to blackmail Costa, and Costa fired him. However, supposedly impressed by the young man's audacity, Costa offered Kevin to join a secret club of hired assassins. According to his words, it was an elite group of trained killers who received thousands of dollars for complex tasks ordered by the CIA. Costa mentioned that all recruits had to undergo an initiation ritual. Kevin agreed and allowed himself to be taken to the woods and bound. Costa promised that he and Deirdre would simply shoot near his feet for a few minutes to make sure he wouldn't flinch and would be capable of such work. Suddenly, Costa gave Deirdre a signal and she shot Kevin 3 times in the chest. Because it wasn't Kevin's initiation, it was Deirdre's. Then she approached the young man, grabbed him by the hair, lifted his head, and shot him in the temple. After that, Costa took his AK-47 and fired a final shot into Kevin's head. Then they both left without even untying their victim. As a successfully completed initiation ritual, Costa gave Deirdre a black beret and promised to make a monogram for the secret club when she tracked down and killed the next target. Upon hearing this story, the investigators began to suspect that they were dealing with a deranged person. The murder of a teenager whose disappearance wasn't even reported. Her words seemed too far-fetched to believe. To expose the liar, They asked her to lead them to Kevin's body. Without hesitation, Deirdre showed them the way. The poor boy's body still lay in the woods, where the lovers had left him, but that wasn't all. Deirdre made an even more significant statement that caused a sensation. She claimed the existence of a video capturing Kevin's execution. Initially, Deirdre was enthused about the recording, but then she realized that Costa would use it to keep her as his accomplice under control. Was the girl trying to portray her lover as a psychopath to protect herself? Or was there really a video that would lift the veil of secrecy over the hired assassins club? The investigators had to ascertain this. Costa, of course, denied everything, but upon obtaining a search warrant, the police found a cassette in his garage. It was a fully captured video of the teenager's murder. The boy screamed in pain and terror so intensely that the police officers in the room took a while to recover from what they had witnessed. But the crucial evidence in the recording was that Deirdre followed the instructions of a man behind the camera, a man with a distinct Greek accent. Simultaneously, the police unearthed the sports bag mentioned by Lisa. Inside were an AK-47 and the .22 caliber pistol, which the two had used during Kevin's murder. Deirdre Michelle Hunt and Konstantinos Fotopoulos were charged with the murder of Kevin, Brian, and the attempted murder of Lisa. During Deirdre's trial, prosecutors portrayed her as a ruthless and cold-blooded killer, but during Costar's trial, they presented her as his victim, someone who believed in his fabrications about secret agents and an exclusive club of top-notch assassins. The prosecutors themselves admitted to perceiving Deirdre's role differently in this case and couldn't agree on the matter. Perhaps the truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Deirdre's mother testified in her favor, confessing to mistreating her daughter when she was a child. Deirdre saw nothing but chaos in her life, so it's not surprising that she fell under Costar's influence. According to her testimony, Costa physically and psychologically tortured her, extinguished cigarettes on her, burned her with an iron, and committed other atrocities. An hour before the verdict was announced, she decided to admit her guilt in the crime to avoid the death penalty. However, the judge showed no sympathy towards her. Watching the video of Kevin's murder was enough for him to sentence her to death. Deirdre appealed based on the fact that while she was in prison, awaiting the opportunity to testify against Costa, her lawyer struck a deal with a television show to sell her interview for $5,000. Deceptively, he brought the filming crew to his client, claiming it was merely preparation for her testimony in court, but once there, he revealed they were journalists and persuaded her not to resist and to tell her story. The lawyer was banned from practicing law for a year as punishment. Deirdre's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Costa, who was also sentenced to death, filed appeals, but they were unsuccessful. He is still awaiting the execution of his sentence and possibly enjoying some attention by entertaining viewers with his tales about the CIA. Fortunately, even in this story, there are some positives. The doctors chose not to remove the bullet from Lisa's head, but she fully recovered and continues to lead a normal life, carrying on her father's work in Daytona Beach. She married a wonderful person and left behind the story with Costa and the 6 unsuccessful attempts on her life far behind her. In July 2019, an unprecedented scandal erupted in Romania, demonstrating how the police respond to calls to the emergency service. The call to number 112 was received on July 25th at 11:05. The caller, a 15-year-old schoolgirl named Alexandra Masisanu, struggling to speak, told the operator that she had been kidnapped, beaten, assaulted, and was being held against her will in some house.
Alo?
Bună ziua!
Bună ziua!
Vreau și în legătură cu poliția.
Da. Ce s-a întâmplat?
Doamnă,
Nu vă nimic.
sunt domnișoara, am 15 ani și ieri am fost sechestrată de către un domn.
Cum te cheamă?
She didn't know where she was, but only knew that she was in the city of Caracal. Before the call was interrupted, the operator sarcastically asked how they would find her if she didn't tell them her location.
Mă cheamă Alexandra, vă rog, veniți repede, nu știu unde sunt.
Cum adică nu știi unde ești? În ce localitate te afli?
În Caracal. M-a dus în Caracal, dar nu știu unde exact.
Păi dă-mi un punct de reper unde te afli în Caracal. Cum crezi că te găsim?
Fortunately, Alexandra called again at 11:06, and the operator once again tried to ascertain her location. The girl managed to provide important details. For example, she had seen a dam before the kidnapper blindfolded her eyes. He had a gray car, and she was being held in a very old,
Dilapidated house near a gas station. There was a lot of grass and bushes in the yard, as well as 2 dogs. She even mentioned a name and an address that she read from a business card she found and explained that she was calling from the kidnapper's phone. The operator relayed the situation to a police officer who continued to communicate with the girl. He told her to stay where she was because they were sending a team. Alexandra tried to provide more description of the kidnapper's car in the yard, but the police officer wasn't listening anymore. The schoolgirl called again at 11:12 and asked if they had sent anyone to help her. Another police officer replied irritably that the team had already been dispatched but couldn't reach her in 2 minutes. Alexandra begged the police officer to stay on the line with her because she was terrified, but he responded that they had other calls to attend to. "The team will arrive in 2 or 3 minutes, what the hell?" he added. The girl reluctantly agreed. Although the emergency services personnel knew that the kidnapper was supposed to return any minute, they inexplicably called Alexandra 9 more times, but no one answered. Not surprisingly, even if the girl had initially tried to discreetly place the phone back, the kidnapper now knew for certain that she had called the police. 12 hours after Alexandra's call, the police finally brought her father to the station, allowed him to listen to the emergency call, and asked if he recognized his daughter's voice. When the man confirmed that it was her voice, they believed it was not a prank, and only then did they begin their investigation. Unfortunately, the name on the business card Alexandra found belonged to a man who had no connection to the case, and the specialized telecommunications service couldn't trace the origin of the call. Technicians were able to provide the officers with a very wide search radius and 3 possible locations for the girl, but none of the specified locations were correct. At that point, the police turned to surveillance camera recordings to identify a vehicle involved in a similar case. Once they identified the driver, they surrounded his house. Despite not being legally required, the police applied for a warrant and simply waited. They received the warrant at 6 in the morning on July 26th, a staggering 19 hours after Alexandra's call. Only then did they knock on the suspect's house gate. Of course, they were late. Inside the house, they found Alexandra's clothes and jewelry in the car, the girl's earring, and in the yard, a metallic barrel with ashes and human remains. The man stated that he doesn't know any Alexandru Mashishano, and the ashes in the barrel remained after the fire he lit to defend himself from persistent mosquitoes. However, after a thorough examination of the barrel's contents, investigators found 6 teeth. The results of the laboratory analysis left no room for doubt. The teeth belonged to Alexandra. The police arrested the homeowner, 66-year-old Gerga Dinka, a retired mechanic. Neighbors knew Georga as an aggressive and inhumane person. So inhumane that he had a special code for his rare visitors. 3 knocks on the door. He suffered from antisocial personality disorder, had been admitted to a mental institution 5 times, and his troubled childhood could have been a possible reason for his condition. Georga's father worked as a butcher, engaging in illegal meat trade, often killing and butchering animals in front of his son, forcing the boy to assist. This soon became routine, and Georga himself was already killing stray animals for his twisted pleasure. His father was a heavy drinker and frequently beat the boy, using belts, brooms, and even the hose from the washing machine multiple times a day. He also tied his son up with a wire to prevent him from going outside to play with other kids. Interestingly, later on, Georga started treating his own victims the same way. Not surprisingly, the boy performed poorly in school. However, when he joined the army, it seemed like his life was getting on track, and he found his place, until he assaulted another soldier who turned out to be the son of a defense ministry official. Expelled from the army, Georga returned home and got a job as a general laborer at a hospital. He worked there for 8 years before attempting to find work on construction sites in Italy. Once again, things didn't work out, as he was fired after brutally beating an Albanian worker. After attacking a young woman, he was deported from the country. Upon returning to Romania, he worked as a mechanic, drove taxis, and also collected and sold scrap metal.
Despite his inhumane behavior and reclusiveness, he managed to start a family and became the father of 4 children. His wife, tired of his constant abuse, lived and worked in Italy. Sources close to Gheorghe say that when his wife came to Romania for the last time, he severely beat her. All 4 children left their father's house. 3 sons chose to live with their mother, while the daughter settled in Timisoara. After George's arrest, she insisted that she had no contact with her father, whom she considered mentally unstable. So, as it appears, Gheorghe Dinka was a recluse, living in isolation, and his behavioral issues couldn't resolve on their own. Another shocking piece of news shocked the public. Gheorghe confessed to the murder of the second girl, whom he abducted in April, 2 months prior to Alexandra's kidnapping. The second victim of the man was an 18-year-old named Luisa Melencu. Until the age of 12, Luisa lived in Italy with her mother, Monica Melencu, who worked there and engaged in vegetable cultivation. However, in search of a better life and income, Monica moved to the United Kingdom, while Luisa chose to finish school in her homeland and lived with her grandparents. She dedicated a lot of time to her studies and was determined to get an excellent education to find a job with a decent salary to support her family. But she relied on her mother's support for the time being. On April 14th, her mother sent her money for sports shoes. Luisa went to an ATM in Caracal, but for some reason, she couldn't withdraw money. She called her grandfather to let him know she was on her way home and headed to the bus stop. However, since it was Sunday and public transportation was scarce, especially in rural areas where locals often complained about its unreliability even on weekdays, Luisa decided to hitchhike. Unfortunately, Gheorghe Dinka was passing by. He agreed to give her a ride. Luisa struck up a conversation and told him about her failed attempt to get money from the ATM. Upon hearing this, Gheorghe offered her 30 lei, approximately $7, for intimate services. She refused, after which Gheorghe decided to take what he wanted by force. Meanwhile, Luisa's grandfather began to worry because he knew his granddaughter should have been home by now. He called her mobile phone, but she didn't answer. Recognizing this behavior as entirely out of character, he rushed to the police station to report her disappearance. However, the officers dismissed his concerns, attributing Luisa's absence to a potential romantic involvement. Left with no choice, Luisa's family started searching for her themselves, and her classmates spread information about her disappearance on social media. The next day, an unidentified man called Luisa's grandfather, assuring him that Luisa was fine but didn't want to talk to him. He added that they were planning to go to Switzerland together. Not believing a word of the stranger's claim, the grandfather made multiple attempts to contact the police but received no assistance. Luisa's mother, Monica, traveled from the UK, where she had been living and working, and had somewhat better luck with the police. Only on the 4th day did the police begin an investigation which seemed more like mockery of the relatives. Luisa's grandfather was subjected to a polygraph test because they suspected him of withholding information. Finally, on May 30th, the case was handed over to the Directorate for Investigating Organized Crime and Terrorism, DICOT, which announced the opening of a criminal case on June 6th. They decided to investigate Luisa's disappearance as a human trafficking case, as they saw signs that she might have been recruited against her will for sexual exploitation. DICOT continued their investigation when news broke about the disappearance of another girl, Alexandra Mașișanu. A 15-year-old teenager from Dobrosloveni was a student in the 10th grade at one of the top schools in Caracal. On July 24th, Alexandra left her home at 10 o'clock in the morning to meet a friend from Caracal. No one else saw her after that. The girl's parents quickly turned to the police, but the officers did not take their concerns seriously, stating that she was old enough to go out with friends and lose track of time. They advised them to wait. When the truth about the 2 murders came to light, the criminal inaction and negligence of officials and law enforcement personnel triggered a massive political crisis in the country. Many government bodies tried to demonstrate their activity, showing that they were doing their job, but it did not help them. The Minister of the Interior, the head of the criminal police, the director of the rescue service, the police leadership, and the prosecution in Caracal were all dismissed. The Prime Minister dismissed the Minister of Education, who cynically remarked that young girls should think twice before getting into strangers' cars, as if she were unaware of the problems with public transportation in the country and the fact that hitchhiking is sometimes the only way to travel in small towns. The police claimed that the Special Telecommunications Service employees could not provide more precise information about the origins of the calls, leading to their search efforts being focused in the wrong places. However, the police were also criticized for their slow and chaotic response. Frustrated, the grandfather of Luisa labeled them as criminals being paid by the government to not do their job. At the same time, questions arose about the remains of the murdered girls. Here is where the most significant mystery of this story begins. Giorga stated that he burned the bodies. He scattered fragments of Luisa's bones in the forest and disposed of her clothes. However, he did not have time to do the same with Alexandra's clothes and body. Investigators reconstructed the crime scenes. Giorga was asked to guide the investigators step by step to all the places he had been on the days of the deaths of Luisa and Alexandra. At this point, he started to contradict himself in his statements, allegedly struggling to remember what he did at the time. According to criminologists, Giorga intentionally led them on a wild goose chase. Although he confessed to the 2 murders he was asked about, when he was requested to repeat his actions during the crimes and show where he left the remains, he panicked. This might be because he probably had a secret location where he hid all his victims. As there were likely more than 2 bodies in that hidden place, he led the investigators on a wild goose chase, pretending to be confused, not understanding and not remembering anything. Although fragments of bones were found in the forest, experts believed that the bodies were either in the Danube or the Olt River. In November 2019, while in prison, Giorga began to write a confession detailing what he had done to Luisa and Alexandra. He started his account with the incident on April 14th, when he stopped his car as Louise was hitchhiking on the road. He agreed to give her a ride and engaged in conversation with her during the journey. He realized that he was becoming sexually aroused. His thoughts were consumed by nothing else but fulfilling his own desires. The man offered the girl 30 Romanian lei, about $7, for intimate services. When she declined, he struck her in the face and bound her with a belt. Interestingly, Giorga also blindfolded her so that the victim wouldn't know the way to his house. Does this imply that he intended to release her alive? After parking the car at his house, the man noticed his 36-year-old neighbor, Stefan Repeziano, in the yard. Stefan occasionally helped Giorga clean up the yard. Seeing a beautiful young girl in the car, Stefan asked who she was. With no other option, Giorga said that he brought her for intimate services, and the neighbor asked to join him. Giorga agreed. The men subjected Louise to humiliation and continued to torment her for 4 days. On the morning of the 4th day, Giorga lost his temper when the girl tried to resist him for the last time. He violently beat her and left her in a pool of blood on the bed, briefly stepping out to feed otters. When he returned, it was already too late to help the girl. The man didn't panic. He placed her in a metallic barrel and set it on fire, covering it with plastic and cardboard. Then, he went to sleep. When he woke up, he collected the ashes and fragments of bones and scattered them along the border of the nearby forest. Giorga's account of what happened to Alexandra was even more sinister. On July 24th, 2 months after Louisa's murder, he noticed the same girl hitchhiking on the road again. Even though he was driving in the opposite direction, he turned the car around and offered her a ride. The story repeated itself. He offered Alexandra 50 lei for intimate services, and upon her refusal, he abducted her. He brought the bound girl to his home, immediately tying her to the bed and subjecting her to violence. The next day at 6 in the morning, Giorga was drinking coffee while his victim lay tied to the bed. The girl complained of a terrible headache and said she needed a painkiller. Giorga suggested going to buy some medication. Before leaving, he additionally tied her with ropes, wires, and a chain. In addition to the medication, he bought a prepaid card to call Alexandra's mother. Inserting it into the girl's mobile phone, he called her mother and claimed to be Alexandra's boyfriend, assuring her that everything was fine. Then he discarded the phone. The phone was later found, and some children played with it. The man returned home around noon. He saw that Alexandra had freed herself and was wandering around the house with his mobile phone. He struck her several times, causing her to fall and hit her head on the concrete floor, resulting in her death. The man wrapped the body in bedsheets, placed some wooden planks and chips, and a 2-liter bottle of Vaseline in a barrel and set it on fire. On top, he threw a thick cardboard. He also threw his mobile phone there. Then he went to sleep. He woke up early in the morning to the barking of dogs, as police were banging on his door. Despite the man's confession and the results of the DNA analysis, the families of Alexandra and Luisa refused to believe that Giorga killed the girls. And the matter was not only in the reluctance of the relatives to believe that they are no longer alive. In fact, there was reason to suspect Giorga of human trafficking and that the girls weren't killed but were sold for exploitation. First of all, in favor of this version is the fact that human trafficking is a very common phenomenon in Romania. Additionally, in 2022, Gheorghe recanted his confession. He confirmed that he kidnapped and mistreated Alexandra and Luisa, but then handed them over to a local criminal boss who sent the girls to a brothel in Turkey. The police allegedly protect this boss, so they tortured Gheorghe and forced him to take the blame for the murder, and they planted Alexandra's teeth themselves. The man's story seems far-fetched if it weren't for some facts. It's unclear why George didn't immediately try to dispose of Alexandra's body, knowing that she had called the police from his phone. Instead of that, he slowly cremated her body for a long 8 hours. Moreover, the burning of an entire human body should produce a very unpleasant smell and smoke. However, the man's neighbors didn't notice any smoke, smell, or anything unusual. The way Gheorghe behaved during the abductions shows that he knew step by step how to act. He knew how to select victims of a specific appearance, and the act of abduction itself seemed standardized. The series of potential crimes was only interrupted when Alexandra pulled him out of this familiar routine by calling the police. Furthermore, investigators speculated that Gheorghe might have had accomplices. The point is, right after the girls' disappearances, unknown individuals called both families several times, assuring them that the girls were all right. At least 2 of these calls were made by Gheorghe, but Alexandra's mother and Luisa's grandfather are convinced that 2 people were calling them. This argument that Gheorghe might have had accomplices prompted not only Romanian police, but also the FBI, Eurojust, and Italy's main anti-mafia agency to get involved in the investigation. Additionally, it seemed to the relatives that the prosecution intentionally prolonged the case. In particular, the prosecutor received video material that indicated Gheorghe's car was connected to Luisa's abduction, but the prosecutor never summoned him for questioning or ordered a search of his car or home. After Alexandra's disappearance until July 27th, he didn't share the surveillance camera footage, which captured Gheorghe's car. Even then, he only showed them a single frame from the video where the car's license plate wasn't visible. Also, on July 27th, after searching the man's house, another accuser not only claimed that Alexandra was killed on that night, but also that strangulation was the cause of her death. However, how could he know this without the victim's body? Gheorghe hadn't made a confession yet. And finally, the most intriguing argument in favor of the possibility that the man might have been involved in human trafficking is that his daughter, Daniela Dinky, assured investigators and the media that she wanted nothing to do with her father and didn't communicate with him. But it turned out to be a lie. She did communicate with her father, and she has a criminal record herself. A few years ago, she was accused of connections to human trafficking networks. Following this, another revelation came in the story. Gheorghe Dinka's son, Dan, was once involved in a group assault and escaped punishment only due to his father's intervention. Allegedly, Gheorghe had connections within the police and the prosecutor's office. The victim was persuaded to withdraw her statement and the case was kept confidential. Equally important in this case is the question of whether Gheorghe's list of victims could be longer. 2 girls were abducted under similar circumstances when trying to hitchhike, and they resembled each other in appearance. This points to a characteristic modus operandi of the criminal, relying on chance and showing an interest in a specific type of appearance. The man's inclination to commit crimes might partly be explained by his suffering from antisocial personality disorder. This condition is characterized by a constant pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lack of empathy, respect for the feelings, needs, or suffering of others, and a lack of remorse after offending or causing harm to another person. Some individuals suffering from this condition cannot form close relationships and use dominance and intimidation to control others. In this context, all the elements of the puzzle come together to form a coherent picture.
But what's surprising is Gheorghe's age, 66 years old. Criminals with a similar diagnosis usually evolve into violent killers during their youth. This disorder remains with a person throughout their life and doesn't appear and then diminish like other mental disorders. In other words, it's rare for a man to suddenly kill 2 girls with a 2-month gap at the age of 66.
Gheorghe most likely committed other heinous crimes in the past. It's unlikely that Alexandra and Louise were his only victims. Very unlikely. Gheorghe was charged with human trafficking, trafficking of minors, 2 cases of assault, 2 murders, and 2 cases of desecration of bodies. But he wasn't planning on surrendering so easily. Dubbed the Caracal Monster, he attempted to sue Romania in the European Court of Human Rights, pointing to a lack of evidence and claiming that he was treated unfairly during his arrest. He fought for a long time, but ultimately lost. On September 23rd, the 69-year-old Gheorghe was sentenced to the maximum possible punishment, 30 years of imprisonment. The thing is, for all the charges brought against him, he should have received 108 years in prison. But for individuals over the age of 65, the maximum punishment is considered to be 30 years. He is also obligated to pay compensation of 700,000 euros to the victim's relatives. The neighbor of the man, Stefan Repeziano, was sentenced to 7 years in prison for his involvement in the violence. In March 2023, Gheorghe once again caught the public's attention by declaring that he had repented and found God. He stated that he was able to forget and leave behind the entire ordeal. In contrast to him, the victim's relatives will never be able to forget what happened. Larry Riskin joined the Navy after school, and over the years of service, he achieved the rank of commanding officer in the Navy fleet. He participated in the Persian Gulf War and demonstrated courage and bravery multiple times, but unexpectedly discovered that he was taking orders from a fragile woman. Larry met Sonia Rios at a barbecue. She owned a beauty salon in the city of Lamita, a suburb of Los Angeles. He was immediately attracted to the very beautiful and striking woman, and within a year, Sonia took her husband's family name and became Sonia Riskin. They settled in Sonia's house. Larry was always extremely close to his family, parents, brothers, and especially his younger sister Sherry Jackson. But everything changed with the arrival of Sonia. She did not allow him to see his relatives, inventing various reasons why they couldn't visit them in Washington. The relationship deteriorated to the point that Larry didn't communicate with his sister and brothers for over 10 years. They only heard rumors that he had resigned and found a job as a teacher for children with special needs. His colleagues remember that he loved children and adored his job. However, he confessed that he was unhappy at home. One thing weighed heavily on him. He dreamed of becoming a father. However, Sonia did not want to have children, and being a very beautiful woman, she misled Larry, pretending to be younger than him. In reality, she was 16 years older. Of course, women at that age are still capable of having children, but Larry felt that his chances of fulfilling his dream were diminishing with each passing day. That's why he grasped at the last straw. In Sonia's homeland, the Philippines, he became attached to his wife's brother's grandchildren, Quincy and Jetmark. The parents of the teenagers believed that with Sonia and Larry in the USA, their children would have a better future, so they supported Larry's proposal to adopt them. Sonia did not object, but insisted on taking care of all the legal matters herself. A year passed, 2, 3, but the process of adoption was not progressing. Larry discovered that Sonia was intentionally sabotaging the adoption process. At that moment, it was his last chance to create a complete family, and he was very disappointed. So much so that he demanded a divorce. Sonia agreed, but with one condition. She asked her husband to go to the Philippines and sell her family business, a taxi company, a matter that needed to be resolved immediately. The man agreed, partly because he wanted to see the children, especially since Quincy's 16th birthday was approaching. Surprisingly, Sonia did not go, even though the matter concerned her family and her business. Before his visit to the Philippines, the first in 13 years, Larry visited his relatives in Washington. He was happy to start a new chapter in his life without his wife but with her nephews, whom he still hoped to adopt. Immediately after landing, Larry went to see them. During the birthday party, Larry noticed that the little cousin of the boys had developed an eye infection. He insisted on taking her to the hospital. Someone present made a call to Sonia and informed her that they would be at the hospital. Larry put the girl in the car and, along with Jetmark and a few other adults, they all went to the hospital. After the visit to the doctor, they got back into the Jeep and were about to return home when a motorcycle approached them. One of the two men on the motorcycle started shooting at Larry's head and abdomen. Then the criminals quickly fled the scene. Jetmark tried to help Larry, and called for help. He was confident that they would save him since the hospital was only a few steps away. But the boy was mistaken. They couldn't save Larry. He was 43 years old. When Sonia was informed of her husband's murder, she completely lost control. She was shaking all over and needed help from neighbors Nicole and Jim Thompson to calm her down. Nicole called Larry's sister, Sherry, to inform her about what had happened, but unexpectedly, Sherry started blaming Sonia for everything. Nicole and Jim didn't take her words seriously. Not then. However, the next morning, Sonia asked Jim again to come and help her search for documents. When Jim learned that Sonia was looking for her husband's insurance policy, he refused to help her. While Larry's family was preparing for his funeral, his wife was only interested in the insurance. Moreover, Sonia had no intention of attending the funeral. She arranged for her husband to be cremated, and the urn with his ashes remained in the Philippines with one of her relatives. Larry's relatives saw this as another blow from Sonia, but they still held the funeral and prepared a niche in the mausoleum, where they hoped to someday place the urn with his ashes. They hoped that the Philippine police would solve this case, confident that Larry's wife was behind it all. But at that time, they still didn't know, nor could they have known, that there was another mystery in this story, another man, and another murder. It was news that had the impact of a bomb exploding. Larry Riskin was not Sonia's first husband, and the reason why they were no longer together with her first husband was that he was killed in the Philippines 19 years ago. The man's name was Earl John Bordeaux. Earl's family lived in Davenport, Iowa, in the same house where he grew up. He was the pride of the family. Earl joined the Navy during the Vietnam War, but his unit was stationed in the Philippines, where he met an attractive local girl named Sonia, who sang at a nightclub near their base. It was obviously love at first sight because the young couple quickly got married, and a few months later, Earl brought his young wife home to meet his family. However, the happy reunion did not go well. The girl did not please Earl's family. Therefore, after his departure from the Navy, they settled in Southern California. Several years later, Sonia opened a beauty salon, and her husband found work in a bakery. Outwardly, it seemed like a family filled with love and harmony. But in reality, Sonia enjoyed giving orders to her military husband and controlled him as she pleased. They lived together for more than 20 years when Earl finally realized that such a family life and his wife's commands were burdening him. Sonia agreed to divorce. But before that, and here a strange sense of déjà vu arose, the husband needed to go to the Philippines to sell the family taxi motor company. Earl didn't want to go, but his wife was inflexible on this issue, and the man chose not to argue. He pleaded with his younger brother Dennis to go with him, but he couldn't quickly obtain a passport, so Earl went to the Philippines alone. It was a hot August night when Earl's plane landed in Manila. He arrived at the house where his wife's relatives lived around midnight. The man was exhausted from the journey, fell onto the couch, and fell into a deep sleep until he was truly killed. When the police arrived, they found Earl lying in a pool of his own blood. He had been shot. The officers concluded that a robber had entered the house and Earl had interfered, but there were no signs of forced entry, nothing was stolen, and the criminal only fired at Earl. 3 men were immediately arrested and charged with the murder. Later, 2 more were detained. They were all members of Sonia's family. Fresh human blood was found on the shirt and pants of one of Sonia's brothers. There was enough evidence to send the culprits to prison for a long time. But then came a surprise. Since Sonia was the closest relative, according to Philippine law, she was supposed to attend a preliminary hearing in court where charges would be brought against her family members. However, since she didn't show up, the charges were dropped and the case was closed. The local authorities claimed their hands were tied, at least officially. Unofficially, the locals gossip that Sonia paid to make all the problems go away. As they explain it, $1,000, and the witnesses would stay silent and the evidence would disappear. Earl's brother, Dennis, felt guilty because he let his brother go alone, so he constantly called a lawyer in the Philippines, spending thousands of dollars on his own investigation, hoping to make Sonia worried. But instead, he became the target himself. He received around 200 threats over the phone, but he didn't calm down. He reported Sonia to the police and the FBI. As a result, he became the target of the killer. It happened once while he was fishing. The shooter missed, but it didn't end there. Later, the attack happened right near his garage. Dennis informed the FBI about everything, but nothing happened. The Bordeaux case was forgotten until, after 10 years, Dennis learned that Sonia had a second husband, and he suffered the same fate as his brother. Dennis hoped that the renewed interest in Sonia could also revive interest in his brother's case. Once learning Sonia's plans to obtain not only all the property but also her husband's insurance, things didn't go as planned. The insurance company hired a private investigator who quickly discovered that fraud was nothing new for Sonia. She had burned down her beauty salon for insurance purposes, manipulated taxes and receipts. She had been caught twice before, so her name was known to the police. The investigator provided his report to the employer, and the insurance company refused to pay Sonia the insurance money. However, the investigators' work impressed Sherry and her family so much that they hired him to investigate the murders. He quickly found out that Earl's and Larry's murders were similar in that the Sony brothers were involved in both crimes. They, like other family members, were financially dependent on Sonia and were willing to do anything she demanded. Sherry, just like Dennis, handed everything the private investigator found to the FBI, hoping that an investigation would finally begin. However, weeks and months passed and nothing changed. Sonia continued working at her salon as usual. But after the new year, Sherry started receiving emails. The author claimed that Sonia was responsible for Larry's murder and offered to return his sister's ashes. The emails were signed by John Bordeaux. How could that be? Bordeaux was the surname of Sonia's first husband, but Earl John Bordeaux had long been dead. It turns out that Sonia had a son whose existence she kept secret. She gave birth to a boy in the Philippines when she was a very young girl, a teenager. Earl adopted the boy after their wedding. Earl's family knew nothing about him, nor did Larry's family, despite Larry's desperate desire to have children. Nevertheless, Sherry decided to respond to the emails, primarily because she wanted to return Larry's ashes. John asked for $35,000 in return, but the more they corresponded, the more Sherry became afraid of what kind of person he might be. What if he was a fraud or something worse? With each new letter, she realized that he was indeed worse. For an additional fee, he offered another service to kill Sonia, whom Sherry despised. Sherry was frightened, not knowing how to escape this situation and fearing what else might happen. Her fears were not unfounded. On April 27, 2007, in Lamita, the 60-year-old owner of a beauty salon was found murdered. She had been shot, and the killing resembled an execution rather than a random shooting. The victim was Sonia Riskin, known as the Black Widow of Lamita, who was suspected of killing not one, but two husbands. She met the same fate as her victims. The arriving police were struck by the meticulous and well-kept nature of the house. It appeared that the owner rarely received visitors during her lifetime, which perfectly matched her character as a reclusive and suspicious woman. It was also interesting to note that there were no signs of forced entry. It seemed that the killer simply entered the house and shot his victim. Her purse remained untouched, along with the cash inside. The neighbors saw nothing. The victim's relatives immediately rushed to the scene, among them her beloved nephew, Eric de la Cruz. Sonia regarded him as her favorite grandson and was proud of him. The young man served on the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier and had just returned home after a tour of Asia. Upon hearing that his beloved aunt had been killed, he immediately informed the police that if something happened to Sonia, John Bordeaux was responsible for it all. John Bordeaux didn't have to be searched for. as he was the one who found Sonia's body and contacted the rescue service. The detectives immediately found the relationship between the son and Mother strange. There wasn't a single photograph of him in the house, no hint of a son, as if he didn't exist for Sonia. Overall, he seemed like the family outcast, especially compared to Sonia's favorite, Eric. John explained that although he and his mother sometimes couldn't find common ground and didn't communicate, the situation had improved recently, and he would never harm her. When asked who he believed could have committed the murder, he could only mention Sherry, Larry's sister. After all, she genuinely hated Sonia, as did Dennis. The FBI questioned both of them, but they had alibis. Moreover, no one was as devastated by Sonia's death as these two. They hoped Sonia would pay for her terrible actions by going to prison, so the detectives turned their attention back to John. The electronic emails signed with his name didn't work in his favor. Furthermore, he failed the polygraph test. Even his own relatives considered him the murderer. Allegedly, no one else had the motive, opportunity, and means to commit the crime, but he insisted on his innocence and stood his ground. Therefore, the detectives didn't rush to arrest him, and they were rewarded with a clue from the Black Widow herself. A few days before Sonia's death, she contacted the police to report two strange incidents at her beauty salon. The first time, a young man appeared at her hairdressing salon wanting a haircut. He called her from the parking lot, and Sonia saw him through the window. She became suspicious because he had a short, military-style haircut. It was clear he didn't need a haircut, so she told him that she only served regular clients, which he wasn't. It seemed like the incident was resolved, but 2 days later, the same guy returned to the salon and this time acting more aggressively. He opened fire on Sonia, causing her to panic and call the police. She informed the officers that she didn't know the shooter, but she remembered he had called her 2 days ago. The cautious woman recorded his number. It belonged to a certain Fernando Romero. Romero himself had disappeared, but the detectives only needed a warrant to access the history of his calls. They expected the phone to lead them to John Bordeaux, but no, his number wasn't listed. Instead, they found the number of someone they knew well. A person who had communicated with Fernando not once or twice, but frequently, especially in the hours before and after the murder. The number belonged to Sonia's beloved nephew, Eric de la Cruz. Further on, after a week, the news reached the FBI. Specialists were investigating the IP addresses from which the supposed letters from John Bordeaux were sent. All of them led to Asia, Hong Kong, Korea. These addresses belonged to naval bases. The FBI employees knew that Eric and Romero were two sailors who served on an aircraft carrier. It was likely that they knew each other. Could these young individuals have planned the murder while being on an American military ship? The FBI investigated the location of the ship during the time the emails were sent. It was in ports in Hong Kong, Japan, and South Korea at the same time the letters were sent. However, sending letters is one thing, but why would Eric kill a woman who cared for him better than his own son? Sonia was killed late in the evening on Friday, and on Monday morning, even before the office opened, Eric was already waiting for her lawyer. He wanted to know how much money he would inherit from his beloved aunt. However, Sonia had another card hidden up her sleeve. Eric didn't receive a cent. All her money, homes, cars, absolutely all of Sonia's belongings were left to her son, Jean Bordeaux. But the young man had another harsh blow awaiting him. It turned out that all this time, while he believed he was the main suspect of the police, Jean Bordeaux was being misled. And when the investigators simply presented him with a photograph of Fernando Romero, Eric lost his ability to speak. Choking on surprise and stumbling over his words, he blurted out that he had conducted his own investigation and Fernando had nothing to do with it. He must have realized that Fernando was the thread leading the investigation back to himself. Both young individuals were arrested and charged with the murder of Sonia Riskin. The police apologized to John for pressuring him. He was still frightened after what he had to endure, but he understood that the detectives were just doing their job. In February 2011, the trial began. Fernando and Eric were tried together. The prosecution faced a difficult task. The victim of the murder herself was suspected of orchestrating the killings of 2 husbands. The accused, the young sailors, could elicit sympathy and comparison. The prosecutor decided to be honest with the jury. He portrayed her as a cold-blooded killer deserving punishment, but now it was necessary to punish the defendants who not only killed a woman but also attempted to frame her son. It worked. The jury found the 2 guilty. They were sentenced to imprisonment ranging from 26 years to life. It was an astonishing family. They eliminated anyone in their path for financial gain. Sonia and her brothers killed Earl. Sonia and her brothers killed Larry. And Eric killed his beloved aunt. How many murders can there be in one family if it's not a Game of Thrones? The irony lies in the fact that Sonia killed 2 people who did nothing wrong and were always kind to her. Eric killed a person who had always been kind to him for the sake of money he never received. The Black Widow of Lamata truly reaped what she sowed. In 2019, Sherry went to the Philippines to personally try to find Larry's remains. She could only ascertain that the remains were passed from one relative to another under Eric's orders. In the end, her search led her to a house that had obviously been vacant for a long time. She couldn't fulfill her dream of returning with her brother's urn to their homeland.